All right, it looks like we have everybody. Sarah, do you see everybody as well? Just making sure.
Yes, I see everybody here.
All right, I'd like to call the special finance meeting of the whole, the Allentown School District for today, Monday, June 29th, 2020, to order. There was no executive session meeting held today. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to discuss the final 2020-2021 budget, as well as the homestead, farmstead exclusion calculations, as well as the exclusion resolution. Mr. Parker, do you have any comments to share?
No comments.
Okay. So now we'll have any comments from the public that would like to speak on agenda items. I see one, Sharon Billington.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please state your name and address for the record.
Sharon Billington, 1509 Chew Street, Allentown. Once again, we find ourselves at the same place that we have been in for the past 3 years. Even with the cuts that were implemented as part of last year's budget, more revenue is needed, and that comes from taxes. The board is constantly saying that Allentown's children deserve better. If you really mean that, then you need to make the politically unpopular and difficult financial decisions that are necessary to give them that better. If the children are the most important concern, then taxes must increase. It is all of our responsibility as residents of Allentown and under the public school funding structure as established by the Commonwealth to fund public schools through property taxes. The argument is being made that other districts are not raising or only marginally raising their taxes due to COVID. That is because they are taking money from their fund balances. Allentown does not have that luxury due to fiscal mismanagement and short-sightedness of previous administrations and boards. A 4% tax increase equates to about $90 to $100 a year for the average homeowner. Whether we are a senior, a young family, or a generation X, Y, or Z individual, it is our responsibility to assist in providing a free, accessible, equitable, quality education as the generations before us had done for us. That means you skip your Wawa or Dunkin' Donuts coffee one day a week. You eat out in instead of out once a month. You reduce your cigarette purchases by 1 pack a month. You buy 6 less cases of beer or wine a year, and so on. Even in the toughest of times, we all have places where we can thoughtfully spend and save. As for our seniors, of which I will soon be one, and having lived in North and South Side Allentown apartments in row home all my life, investing in our children's education means that I will be able to collect Social Security because this investment will enable our kids to go to work and pay into those systems that we take for granted and that have been there for us. So instead of once a year complaining and criticizing and being angry at the district, we all need to, all year long, use our voices to tell Harrisburg to change the funding structure of our public schools, to develop a fair and equitable charter school funding practice, to fully fund mandated policies, and to lobby both the state and federal governments to pass the over 200 separate pieces of legislation that are currently stalled due to politics. Do I want another tax increase? Of course not. But I learned long ago in my US government course at William Allen High School, not only about my rights as an American, but also my responsibilities. I also learned that change happens when people show up, speak up, and step up, as recent events are reminding us, not by complaining, criticizing, and ignoring these issues and problems, or only speaking up when it's convenient or politically motivated soundbite. We all need to do our part to show our children that they are valued, that they have a future, and that they are worth more than a pack of cigarettes. The district needs to continue to approve and be financially transparent and responsible. The board needs to advocate as a board and with other boards across the state for funding changes in Harrisburg and have the backbone to make politically unpopular but necessary decisions. And the public needs to accept our responsibility in this process by questioning expenditures and district policies, offering insights and suggestions for improvement, and using our voices and votes in Harrisburg and Washington. A quality education should be readily available to all children, simply because it ensures a brighter and better future for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Do we have any other comments from the public on agenda items? Okay, I'm seeing none. I will now turn over to Josephine for presentation of item number 1.
Okay, thank you and good evening. I'm going to pause a moment to see if the memo.
Josephine, you're okay. I'm gonna jump into the presentation here.
Oh, okay.
So I'm gonna share my screen. I closed my PowerPoint, of course I did. Oh my God, I'm going. There we go. Okay. Slideshow. Before we begin, Mr. Parker, I just wanted to obviously kick it to you to open. You're muted though.
I said some really wonderful things while I was muted. So as we find ourselves at the end of the 1920 fiscal year, and one that is unlike any other that we've seen, and prepare for the next school year, we're here to present our final budget. From the original inception of this school year, we knew that this would be a challenging year. If you think back a few years from our fiscal audit, it identified a troubling future for the school district based on a decreasing fund balance, the elimination of a fund balance and an increasing deficit. So as we present the budget this evening, it is against the backdrop of the understanding that, those fiscal constraints were there. We had the opportunity to realize some sort of a silver lining from the pandemic that has brought a lot of destruction and craziness to our world. With the district shutting down over the past few months, there were some savings in the 1920 school year, which allowed us to enter the 1920 budget in a little bit better position, as well as the federal government, and kudos to them, hats off in major and significant ways, Representative Weil and her colleagues in Washington, identifying funds in CARES to support districts in their operation during the next school year with the COVID pandemic. So in the midst of a lot of chaos and uncertainty, we find ourselves presenting a budget this evening that will, I think, represent where we've been as well as where we need to go. So with that, I will pass the ball back to Ms. Ramos to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a minute to thank our finance team. Ms. Kakasi hasn't even been here a year yet. She's kind of jumped right in and done whatever we need her to do, and Ms. Hauser, who's been stepping into multiple roles to assist us. And also our grants team under Dr. Brown's leadership, they've really pushed us to make sure that we're very strategic and intentional with our grant dollars. And also just a shout out to our finance co-chairs who we've really taken a lot of their time up during budget season in quite a few meetings. So it's been a team effort to kind of get to this point. Tonight, we're going to walk through, similarly to we have in prior years, quick reminder of our Act 1 timeline, our budget process, and kind of how we've improved that process over time. Just a quick highlight on where the curriculum audit has shown our budget impacting our academic program. And then going in briefly to 1920, because it's crucial for the board and the public to understand where we end, because that's ultimately where we begin for 2021. Within that projection, we'll highlight where we've reduced some expenses and where some COVID-related areas have impacted our budget. And then for the majority of the presentation, we want to make sure that we highlight for our 2021 final budget where we've made some adjustments since we last presented to you in May. And then we'll close with the tax rate comparisons and homestead calculations, so the board has all the information they need to make their decisions. So as you're aware, back in May, we presented our proposed final budget for the board's consideration, and that was approved. That approval resulted in the posting of our PDE 28 and the document going on display. And tonight we're here with two action items, essentially. One is on a request to vote to approve a final budget, and one is on a request to vote to approve our homestead farmstead resolution. And in that regard, you may notice we do have Mr. Chris Bamber here. He's from PFM, and he's the person who assists us with homestead farmstead calculations. So should questions arise, he's on deck to assist us with those answers. So this year was a year where we were really trying to dig in to make some improvements to budget process and processes in the financial accounting in the district in general. And we've talked about it for quite some time that our chart of accounts hadn't been updated. PDE updates the chart of accounts every year, and historically Allentown wasn't able to kind of keep up with those updates. This year, Ms. Hauser and Ms. Casey have worked really hard in the finance office, spending a lot of time and delegating a lot of that work out so that we have an updated chart of accounts to help inform our spending and ensure that we're coding properly. You've probably also heard ad nauseum column 6. Column 6, we're proud of the fact that we got to a place where we're actually able to provide you end of year projections rather than what the district had historically provided the board, which was simply another column with a proposed budget in it. It includes a lot of detail to get to that point, and we want to make sure that we're highlighting the fact that we're able to project those expenses and help the board understand where we're ending, which is ultimately where we were going to start our 2021 budget, rather than simply just increasing and doing that type of thing. The other thing that we did this year was we made sure that every department and every building principal had a consistent budgeting template that include 3 years of history. And that history was across whatever account codes we needed to ensure they had and whatever detail we needed, so that they had the ability to look back at the decisions that were made historically and then attempt to look forward at the priorities they needed to budget for, and ultimately begin to also budget and pay very close attention to what they were using grant funds for as well, which is another highlight. And I want to make sure that I shift to Dr. Brown for the next two items, because that's her shop and we've made a lot of headway there.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, so I thought that you had gone through did you finish this slide?
No, I didn't go through the bottom two. I wanted to let you celebrate those.
Well, yes, it is a celebration. Relentless effort and is very tiresome. And I know that we went through a lot of long discussions and spirited conversations, but we were able to develop an equitable allocation process for grants and our general fund, which not only utilized our direct certification numbers. And again, that's important because it's a really clean, accurate process and data snapshot that comes from the state as opposed to our own internal data sources. We use that, and we also began to weight our student variables. So that means as we were developing these budgets within our general fund, we realized that it costs differently to provide for an English learner student versus a SPED student versus an economically disadvantaged student within the classroom and the building. And so we wanted to be cognizant of that and make sure that we included that weight to account for those variables. The budget templates, again, were meant to serve as another tool to get our building leaders used to the variables that we needed to account for, and just to begin to adopt a clean, disciplined approach to developing budgets for our grant dollars. Again, as we have done and we will continue to do, we always circle back to those organizational driver documents, which one of them is the curriculum audit. And within the audit, we saw several indicators of or impediments that were caused by our deficit in our fund balance and our overall budget, if you will. And first and foremost, you could summarize that by the constriction of the fiscal resources, which didn't allow us to prioritize poor achievement and academic inequities in our budgets. We absolutely are now doing that in terms of budgeting as well as staffing. Just a highlight and another sort of variable that we have to be aware of and accommodate for. All of our secondary schools now have 1 or 2 school improvement designations. So we know that all of our middle schools have the CSI designation, but all 3 of our high schools, Building 21, Deerup, and Allen, maintain a targeted school improvement designation, and the 2, Allen and Deerup, additionally maintain an ATSI designation. And why that's important is because while the CSI designation comes along with funding and you're able to prioritize all of the resources and supports that you need within that CSI funding pot, the same is not true for your ATSI and your TSI designation. So that means that at the building level and the district level, we have to not only reallocate, but again, back to that notion of a disciplined approach to funding allocation and spending for those buildings in order to support improved achievement for the subgroups that each building has been identified. And as we were discussing last month in the education committee meeting, just to draw a line and reiterate, our high schools and our middle schools are identified in the collective for the low achievement of the subgroups that you have listed before you. We then go on to talk about how our budgets address performance gaps, graduation rates, as well as distribution and trying to be more consistent district-wide. So I'll hand it back to you, Jen. I think that's the last slide in terms of fiscal equity.
Thanks, Dr. Brown.
You're welcome.
I was muted again. So when we think of, and this connects to the conversation at the very top of the presentation, we know that there are some COVID-related reductions / expenses / revenue issues, as well as some expense considerations for the future. Because school was closed down for a significant period of time, the district was able to realize a reduction in the cost for supplies as well as utilities. It was a mild winter and then a shutdown, so some significant reductions in the cost of our utilities. We had a significant reduction in transportation. We created or negotiated a settlement with our transportation company to reduce that cost to, I believe, 65%, which was for all of the districts around us that kind of proceeded as Harrisburg kind of directed. That was one of the lowest that we were able to see during that time. We also had a reduction in contracted services. Our substitute services weren't needed during COVID, obviously. So those are general fund expenditures that we were able to hold in our budget for the 19-20 school year. So all of those are kind of outcomes of COVID, not celebrating COVID, but absolutely going to acknowledge the spaces where not being in classrooms allowed us to reduce expenses and actually increase our bottom line number for the 19-20 school year. As we look into the next school year, there are a number of expense considerations that we're keeping fairly close to our considerations. The $9.8 million that the district was able to receive in CARES 1, and there are a number of iterations of CARES in CARES 1. Those are funds that have been directed primarily to maintain the LEA's operation into the current into the next school year. But we also have some other concerns that we're going to have to watch, and our COVID-2 financing that has become available, as well as additional resources that we're going to advocate and push for over the next few months, are going to be directed to supporting what we don't fully know will be some increased costs in a few areas of consideration. First and foremost, there's technology related items. We're able to address a lot of technology in last year's budget with reallocating of title funds to purchase devices for all students. But as we move forward into the next school year and expand virtual academy offerings, we want to keep an eye on technology, because we believe that will be an area where we may need additional resources directed either in devices or in connectivity for our students, or professional development for our staff. Again, food service is an absolute unknown area of impact. When the food service amount that the district receives is based on children served, and not having a really good, clear picture of the number of children served or what that may mean next year through the duration of the year, whether that's starting school with every kid in the district in the building, and then at some point when cold season hits, maybe having to go back to an online format. There are a number of variables there that have to be kind of considered as we move throughout the school year. So we're keeping an eye on that. Transportation is another area where we're absolutely keeping an eye on what transportation costs and impact may be based on the number of students that we're going to be able to have on buses for our students that are bused in the district that are IEP students, as well as our students that are in charter schools. The potential for exponential cost impact and transportation is high. So we're going to keep an eye on that one through the next year as well. Cleaning supplies and PPE, absolutely. We would expect there to be a significant uptick in the need and i.e. the cost in those areas, as well as signage in our buildings to kind of direct the flow and social distancing. So a number of areas that we have under consideration for expenses. Some of these we can embed costs in our current supply line items and budgets. Some of these we have an additional funding of CARES that are going to be able to address some of them. And then there are others that we're just going to have to keep an eye on and watch. And when we know what the cost factors may be, push and advocate for resources to support.
Do you want me to start, Jen?
Sure.
Okay. So a couple of other things that helped us out in the current year, besides some of the reductions that we saw for not having kids in our buildings over the last couple of months, probably the biggest one, the largest impact is our charter school tuition rate was significantly decreased over original projections because our ADMs, which is your average daily membership, increased significantly. Those numbers are released by the state in May. So we don't have those numbers at the beginning of the year when we calculate the original tuition rate per child. So last year's calculation of tuition rate was based on the best information that we had at the time, which was the 18-19 budget dollars and the the 17-18 ADMs. The 18-19 ADMs were released late in the year, which is normal. And when we recalculated our tuition, we saw significant tuition savings for charter schools. Some of the other expense reductions, we really limited conferences and travel, tried to keep everyone local, tried to do as much webinars as possible. And then for the last 3 months of the year, nobody was allowed to go anywhere. So that was, that assisted us as well. Across all departments and the schools, you know, Mr. Parker touched on it previously, there was a reduction in supplies needed. Utilities were especially low. We did have a mild winter. They weren't, and then with the buildings all closed up, we were able to reduce there as well. And I think that's pretty much it for the major 1920 expense reductions. We can move to the next slide.
So that leads us into our end of year projection. And again, it's our 2021 budget presentation, but all that to say, we've got to make sure that everyone has a consistent understanding of where we're ending, because that's ultimately where we begin. This is what we have endorsed as column 6, but we have it on horizontal. But this is our column 6 end of year projection, which we just presented at the board meeting last week. But I'll let Tara speak to it in a little more detail, but that'll take us through 1920.
Sure. So as I mentioned during the April and May board meetings, what happened in May and June was really going to key us into how the end of the year was going to look. We were able as a district to meet our collection rate for our real estate taxes, which was pretty significant considering the situation. Usually those taxes are all paid by December. At December, we were still looking at a significant amount outstanding, but that caught up in the last 6 months of the year, and we really did well there. We were also fortunate in that earned income tax came in significantly higher for the first 3 quarters of the year, and then pretty much flat to plan for the 4th quarter of the year. And we'll continue to see some receipts for that, because that's delayed. Earned income tax comes after people earn the money and they remit it to the district. And there was a pleasant surprise there. There was almost $700,000 collected in the month of June as of the end of last week. That's the last time that I checked. So we're right on track to ahead of track on our earned income taxes, which is very good news for the district. Basic education funding, all the state funding came in just about where we thought it was going to. The only things that were off a little bit were related to subsidies that we get for Social Security and retirement. Those are directly related to payroll, which when we get to expenses is one of our other good news pieces. So we'll touch on that in a minute. All of the federal monies came in as expected for the current year. It's worth noting there's no CARES money in the 1920 budget. All of the CARES money will be in the 2021 budget. So that did not impact at all where we are ending 1920. Moving to expenses, probably the best news here, there was about, outside of the charter news, there was about $1.5 million in salary savings. We had some vacancies that we didn't fill. And then for the last 3 months of the year, not having to backfill those positions with substitutes, which would normally offset in 2 separate line items, we were able to recognize savings in both places. So that was good news there. So there's about 1.5 million in savings there. Other places that we were able to save, as we mentioned prior, there were some supply savings, utility savings, charter schools. We were originally projecting charter schools to come in around 57.5, and now it's looking like they're going to come in around 54.5 to 55 million, which again is good news. And I think that's really it for savings in the current year. If you remember, we were originally budgeted to end the year with a $6.3 million deficit. As you can see, we made that significantly better, coming in at a $3.7 million deficit. Still a deficit. We still don't see a surplus yet, but it is a almost $3 million less of a deficit, which gives us fund balance going into next year, which will be very helpful to get us through the course of next year, to help us, maintain a positive fund balance. Just for reference sake, we may touch on this later. You should be carrying a fund balance that's approximately 5 to 8% of your total expenditure budget. We're nowhere near that number, as you can tell, but this is still good news for the end of 1920.
So then that takes us into 2020, 2021. I just have a tough time saying the year. And typically we always try to share with the board, where we've adjusted from proposed in May to final in June, and where we're seeing those decision points and things that we have to kind of continue to review, as Mr. Parker mentioned, whether it's in relation to COVID or transportation or whatever the case may be. So as we approach the revenue, obviously we will make sure the board has the information they need to consider the tax revenue. The state subsidy, in May, we had a different budget from the governor than we did a couple of weeks later. So you'll see some updates to the state subsidy and something that we have to continue to watch. Our grant allocations are starting to come. We have almost all of the title final allocations in, and Mr. Parker and Tara both spoke a bit to CARES. And Tara also spoke to the expenses. You know, we're continuing to monitor our charter expenses as the ADMs come in, and we complete our 363 and get our tuition rates calculated. That will drive out our final numbers. In regards to salaries, we're primarily going to touch on benefits. It's an area where we've tried to negotiate and bring that number down from last month, knowing that that's a continued discussion that's out there. Our debt payment will go down a bit. Our Trent interest rate has decreased. We had a nice savings there. And again, the COVID related items will continue to be something that we bring up as they are kind of coming our way and we have to make decisions. So again, there were about 3 areas that you'll see adjustments to from May to June. A recalculation of the millage. Again, the governor's budget, he had given us a nice increase in his 2021 budget, but as a result of COVID, those numbers went back down and we were having to budget back to this flat 1920. So what the governor gave us in 1920 is what the governor's allocated in 2021 for both basic and special education funding. We've also have confirmation on our Title I, Title II, and Title IV grant allocations. So you'll see subtle differences there.
Okay, so I'm going to start walking us through our revenue sources, and then we'll walk through expenses and wrap it up with a total look at the budget overall. In May, we went out with a real estate tax number of about 99 million that included current and delinquent for next year. We made some adjustments to that number. There was some assessed value changes and a millage calculation change that needed to be corrected. And we adjusted some of the expected delinquent receipts for next year, which lowered the real estate tax amount. This still represents a 4% millage increase, but we came down to about 95.9. We held,
Sorry.
it's okay. We held all of our Act 511 taxes flat, and those are actually pretty much flat to the current year as well. Those are things like per capita taxes, your earned income tax. You know, the COVID effect is going to be a multi-year effect. Everyone has said that. So, you know, we're trying not to be real optimistic in some of our tax lines to reflect like high earned income tax and all that kind of good stuff. And then pretty much all of our other donations, rental income, and interest income were pretty much flat to what we mentioned in May. So overall, we're coming in about $3.3 million lower on local revenue from May to June. State revenue, when we first went out in May, we did not have the revised basic education funding number or special education funding number from the state. The numbers that we went out with in May were based on the budget that Governor Wolf released in February. Clearly, after COVID, there were changes to be made, and the General Assembly elected to hold flat all public education funding under the basic ed funding and special ed funding subsidies. So those were reduced, approximately $4 million total. The transportation subsidy, we held the same. State reimbursement for employee benefits, those came down basically because we lowered our payroll expectation for next year, which we'll get to when we speak about when we speak to some of the other expenses later on. Our Ready to Learn, PlanCon, and Homestead, Farmstead tax relief went up. There are different places here and there, but it went up about 600,000 over last month. So overall, we had a reduction in state revenues of about $3.4 million May to June. Our federal funding, the first 4 items are fine, hopefully final numbers from the state and the federal government. The numbers we went out with in May were the 1920 funding levels. We didn't have any better information at that time. Since then, we've gotten our 2021 allocation, and you can see they came down some. Title III actually had a little tiny bump, which was offset with the reductions in Titles 1, 2, and 4. Medicaid reimbursement, we're looking, and Title 19 medical assistance, those look like they may go up around $780,000. Other federal, we are holding flat from where we went out in May. And then the final number is the CARES Act, the portion of the CARES Act that applies to elementary and secondary education relief. And Allentown has been allocated $9.8 million there. So overall, we've increased from last month to this month about $265,000 to the revenue line. I think, Jen, this one's yours.
Yep, I caught myself. I almost started talking. So those were the primary changes that occurred from the proposed final budget to the final budget we're bringing forward tonight in the revenue side. We have a few expense changes as well. And so it's kind of how we've chunked the presentation. Here were the changes to revenue and here's where we're sitting. And now we have some changes to expense. And just to highlight some of those changes as we go into the detail, there are some vacancies that remain in the budget around teaching and administrative positions. We did reduce all building and department budgets by 3%. So there's another decrease in 2021. As Tara mentioned before, our charter school calculations, because the ADM goes up, the tuition rate goes down because there's more students. So when we apply that to 2021, it also brings that number down slightly. From last month to this month, we have a benefits consultant who's working with us. He has helped us negotiate a lower rate with no current plan changes to that healthcare design. So we were able to bring that number down. And you'll notice an adjustment in debt service, I think a little under about 500,000, some around 400,000, based on the finalization of the TRAN and the interest rates. So those are the highlights, and we'll kind of walk you through that detail again, so you can see kind of those line items.
Okay, so these are the major groupings of expenditures for the district. Salaries, you'll notice, came down around $200,000. That's a combination of a couple of things. We reduced positions, but then we had to add some positions back for special education classrooms to keep them at mandated levels, as well as adding back some partial year calculations that for some other positions like the business manager and secondary ed. So we had to add those back in. The $5.9 million in savings for employee benefits, that's all related to the medical plan. As Jen mentioned, we had originally gone out, the original quote that we got when we went out for bid from multiple insurance companies, the lowest one we got was $42 million. We went back to that insurance provider, and our benefits consultant was able to negotiate down to $36 million for our rate for next year with no plan changes. Still not a great number. There's still more savings to be had there, but for right now, that's a little bit of good news on the front, on that front. Tuition for charter schools. So because 1920 came down to about 54 million, we are looking at probably a 6.5% increase to next year, based on 1920's budget increase versus 1819's, which is the budget is how the tuition rates are calculated. With the higher ADMs, looks like we might be saved from where our original calculation came in. We're coming in about 4.2 million less. That's a straight calculation, nothing in there other than calculated numbers. Debt service, there was some good news, as everybody's mentioned, with the TRAN. When we first put the TRAN into the budget, we had estimated rates at where the market was sitting was probably somewhere in a 3.5 to 4% interest rate. The market came back down, which was very good news, and we ended up with 2 3/8 as our interest rate. So that saved us almost $420,000 in interest for next year. And so that was good news. So totally we reduced expenses from last month to this month by almost $11 million.
And then we wanted to just take a deeper dive. As Tara shared with you the healthcare number, and that was in a larger number. We wanted to kind of break down the benefits for you so you could see the impact of healthcare, and then obviously Social Security and PSERS are tied to salary, but this is where that larger number sits.
So you can see the reduction for medical, dental, Social Security and PSERS that's all calculated based on salaries. The difference in the other line, the $515,000 in May represented just tuition reimbursement. There's also an additional fee that if people do not take benefits from the district, we give them a stipend, which is very standard practice. It's costs us less than providing them benefits. And we just added that calculation back into the benefit model on that line rather than up in the medical line. So it's really just a shift in where we accounted for it. So our total benefits, as we mentioned before, came down close to $5.9 million.
And so that was the last of the changes from the proposed budget in May to the final budget we're presenting to you this evening. So we wanted to be able to give you a summary of that in total so you could see it line by line. So basically all of the numbers that Tara just spoke to are here. You'll see in the 2021 and PROP proposed budget column, that was what the board approved in May. The 2021 budget, the middle column, that's what we're requesting the board to consider this evening. And then you can see the changes to which Tara just spoke to around that budget. The left side of the screen is where you're seeing our revenue. The right side of the screen is where you're seeing our expenses. And then obviously the bottom right is where our total deficit and then our year-end fund balance is. So the 2021 budget, the middle column, is showing all things considered in this current budget, a $1.7 million positive fund balance. We also wanted to ensure for the board's consideration that there was significant data around tax rate. So what you'll see is what Tara has organized for us. She can speak to numbers, I can speak to organization. You'll see the millage increase at then a 95.5% collection rate, which was the rate that we had in the 1920 budget. You can see what that gives us over 1920. And what that will do to the average homeowner, and then what each of those millage increases will yield in a fund balance.
So just to walk through what the pieces are. So the millage increase is on the left. We're assuming a 95.5% collection rate, which, as I stated, we actually hit in the current year for 1920, even with the situation that we're in, which is very good news. The average home price of $108,800 is given to us when we get our property assessed value information from the county. That's not something we calculate in the district. That's provided with the property information. So with the increase of a 4% millage, you would end with a positive fund balance of about $1.7 million. Just for perspective, before we talk about other millage rates, the suggested rate of a fund balance for a healthy district of our size would be somewhere between 5 and 8%, which is about $17.5 million. So we're at a 1/10 of that. So I just want to keep that in perspective as we talk about millage increase and structural deficits and trying to build back up the fund balance and coffers of the district.
And Tara, can I jump in there for a quick second?
Sure, absolutely.
Just to add into that conversation, just to make sure we're on the same page. This fund balance is with CARES funding embedded in our budget. So to be really clear, this is not the district individually kind of moving itself. We've reduced the deficit over time, but to get over the hump, the proverbial hump, where there's a balanced budget this year that is with $9.8 million in CARES funds embedded in the budget. And those CARES funds are a one-time infusion of resources to support districts as we go through the next year of uncertainty.
Right. So as you click down the different millage rates, you can see what that means to the average property. A 0% millage increase at the bottom, why there's an increase there, and it doesn't cost anything. So our assessed values in the city actually increased year over year. So a flat millage rate with an increase in assessed value gives you a $948,000 lift. That's your organic growth. And then the other millage increases on top of that would be how you gain back some revenue. It's worth noting anything below a 2.5% millage increase will take your fund balance negative, which would necessitate cutting expenses somewhere in order to bring that fund balance back to positive.
The final two slides tonight, which I'm definitely going to hand over to Tara, and we also, as I said earlier, have Chris Bamber here, are just a brief explanation on homestead, farmstead, because that is something that you are asked to approve, and typically the district hasn't really gone into any level of explanation, so we wanted to try to shift that this year. So Tara, if you want to take it, and obviously we have Chris here.
Sure. So the homestead farmstead exclusion for gaming revenue, we still assess the same value of taxes, but then the state comes in and says, we're going to give your taxpayers a little bit of relief with our gaming revenue from the state. This year, we're going to receive about $9.6 million. That comes as a relief to taxpayers. It doesn't come to the district. It comes as a lowering of the tax bills for the taxpayers. Basically, it does that by coming up with an average exclusion value. So if you have a $100,000 property and our exclusion value, for sake of ease of explanation, is $25,000, we will now tax you on $75,000 because there was relief from the state. There's multiple calculations that are involved in that. First, you start with the amount that the state's given you, you divide by the millage rate, and that gives you an average exclusion value. But then you have to look at that average exclusion value as compared to the assessed value of the properties in the district. And some of those properties get excluded because they fall below that value. So they essentially would come up with a zero tax rate because they're below that exclusion amount. There are limits, so you can't exclude more than half of the value of the property. We're not anywhere near that calculation, so that's, we don't have to worry about that. So we had 15,814 approved homesteads in the district this year on $9.6 million in relief from the gaming revenue. That comes out after there's multiple iterations of calculations you have to go through. That comes out to about a $612 savings per homestead. Homesteads, for the most part, are properties. And that's all I have on that.
Thanks, Tara, because I definitely am still watching that. And then just as we kind of come to a close and shift for questions, a revisit on the timeline, nothing more. Exact same timeline that we opened with, we're closing with. Here we are, June 29th, sitting in our special committee meeting with the final 2021 budget for the board's consideration and a request to approve our homestead farmstead resolution. With that, I don't know, Mr. Parker, if you have any closure, or we can entertain questions.
Open for questions.
Oh, I didn't want to do that.
All right, Lisa, I see your hand up.
Yes, my question is, in those, when you guys were discussing the revenues that we're getting, I saw taxes, I saw, let's see, what did I see? I saw taxes, I saw state subsidies, I saw grants, and I saw CARES. Is there any NIS revenues in there anywhere?
There are none built into this budget now.
So we have, how many budgets do we have? Do we have one, and do we have, this is a real question. I'm not trying to be facetious. So where will we see those revenues? Because my question.
If we get any, Lisa, if they would be part of local revenue. We did not put any NISDA revenue in any of these items. They would come through on that other local line. If we had any, there are none budgeted.
Okay, and my reason for asking that question is because asking for a 4% increase from the people, I don't understand. I'm trying to understand how come we're not asking the people that owe us to give us before we go to the people. Because again, I'm going to go back to, what are we giving our people? If we're going to ask them to raise taxes, if we're not educating our kids and we're not lowering folks' salaries, and I'm not saying that we necessarily have to, I'm just saying, what are we paying for? So I just wanted to ask that question. It's clear that we're not getting anything from the NIS yet, or at this time, and for that reason, it's not documented. Is that correct?
So let me clarify, and I think, and tell me if I'm off here, but there's the properties that pay taxes that are within the NIS zone. That tax revenue is built into our tax revenue number.
Yes.
So that's why. So I guess at somewhere along the way there was, and I'm not a historian here, so I'll probably ask Mr. Thiel, who probably knows more about NIS than I. At somewhere along the way there was, I guess, a separate NIS bucket of resources that came to the district that may have had an expiration date. I'm not 100% sure there, but I know the taxes that the district collects year on year from the properties that are within the footprint of the NIS are embedded in our tax number. So there is revenue from properties in the NIS. It's not broken out separate. It's actually embedded in our overall tax number.
That's absolutely correct.
Spot on that?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. The properties inside the NIS do have assessed value, and that assessed value and the taxes levied against that value are in the real estate tax line. There was, as you mentioned in history, there was a separate NIS revenue, and I don't quite understand how that got calculated and given back to us. But they are paying property taxes in the zone. Does that answer your question, Lise?
You guys, excuse me, but it sort of kind of answered my question, but my problem was, sorry about that. It's hard to work from home, guys. But at any rate, my question was, I wanted to make sure that it was clear to not only myself, but to the public, that we have some knowledge in terms of how much money is actually owed to us. Where is that money? Like, I feel as though us as board members and the public as well, who we're getting ready to ask for 4% tax increase, should have some knowledge in terms of how much money is actually owed to us. It shouldn't just be properties that have NIS monies embedded into us, or there was an agreement made before, but I think it expired. I think at this point, before we make an ask, we should pretty much know.
And may I piggyback on Lisa's question? Where is the NISDA original contract? Because it should not have expired that quickly. I know because I saw it when I was with Mayor Pulowski. It was 30 years. I don't know where the original, we should have original copy of that NISDA contract where we were supposed to get $5 million a year for 30 years. But then they changed, they went to court and changed, you know, how much things were assessed. But there should be original copy somewhere. The school district should have one. Where is it? Find it, please. Now, my other question is this. We had a great presentation. Why is it that the board doesn't get these presentations ahead of time? Why aren't we getting hard copies? This is great. It would have helped me so much to see this ahead of time. To see it on the day that we're voting, that's not cool. Why weren't we given this again? We've been asking for this over and over and over again. Why weren't we given this ahead of time? Please answer.
So I'll answer that in two ways.
Okay.
One, for the work that we're doing, we often aren't able to get some of the presentations complete and out to you beforehand. Those that we can, we do. Some we just can't because we're working on them up till showtime, so to speak. For this one, however, we did send a copy of the budget to the board on last week, I believe Friday afternoon. And Ms. Ramos, I believe the presentation actually went out earlier today.
We did get it out at some point this afternoon, I believe.
This afternoon to the board. So as we complete it, we get it. But sometimes the timing just doesn't give us the ability to get it out to you well in advance.
So you expect us to vote on this when we just get it this afternoon?
But I did at least get the final budget last Friday.
Yeah, I got the budget, but I'm talking about what was presented to us today. That was informative. We didn't get that.
That is just kind of the wraparound for the actual budget that you received last week. This is just kind of our presentation to clarify those pieces of information. And again, when we have the ability to get that information out to you early, we do. This is one where we weren't able to get that information out early, but we were able to get it out before the meeting. And I believe this is the first time that we were able to get it out before the meeting. In years prior, we were working well up to the deadline.
Hi, everybody. This is Linda. So this was sent out on Friday. I wasn't aware that I had to check my email going into the weekend. So is there any way that we can utilize our board secretary to notify us when things are sent like this? Like, I know if it's a regular school board meeting, I know come Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm looking in my emails for things for that week. But something like this, I wasn't looking. So is there any way that we can utilize our board secretary to notify us?
Yeah, I think that's a governance conversation that the board can have amongst itself and its members to identify what roles, responsibilities the board secretary plays, how those play between the board as well as the administration, and then codify the expectations for the role of the superintendent, the role of the board, and the role of the board secretary. I think that's a governance conversation that is probably well overdue.
Well overdue, but we keep asking for it, but it doesn't happen. You say these things, and that's cool. That there's a governance, there's a governance, there's a governance. We ain't had one, what, in 2 years?
And I have a call on Thursday with somebody to try and get a date on a calendar that I will be sending information out to board members about a governance meeting in the future.
And this is what happens when we don't have it.
And we can certainly ask our board secretary to send information, but general rule of thumb as a board member, I would say you should log in every day to see if there's something important, especially knowing that this meeting has been scheduled for a month now. If we didn't have it, you should. I check my email even before I was president. I checked my board email at least once a day to see if anything important came in. Just a general good rule of thumb.
But like you said, like Mr. Parker said, what is expected of the superintendent, what's expected of the secretary, what's expected of us. Governor's meeting.
Okay. Phoebe, do you have any other questions on the budget presentation?
I have a comment to make, if I may.
I just wanted, if Phoebe's.
No, I'm going through my notes. I don't have any more questions.
Okay. Lisa, go ahead.
Okay, being that she doesn't have any more questions, I just want to make a comment because I don't want to turn this into a governance situation. But I know that it was written in the paper and it's been said. It hasn't been 2 years; it's been 3, and it's very important that we have that governance because then we wouldn't keep bringing this stuff up in the public. So I'm glad to hear now, Sarah, that we're going to finally do it, and I look forward to it.
Okay, is there any other questions about the budget presentation? Ms. Johnson-Watts, see your hand up.
Hi, so I wanted to just underline some things and clarify some things, just so that the public understands what we're being presented. So we're assuming that the average home price is $108,800. That's very important to know because that's where that $104, and please confirm, did you mean $104 per year increase?
Yes.
Okay, so that $104 per year increase is if you are a homeowner with a property assessed value of $108,800 a year. If you are someone who has a house that is assessed at $200,000 or more, that could be somewhere higher. The other thing I think we need to be very clear about is the timeline of funding for the CARES Act. When that comes through, that's going to be coming through the state, correct? That's not coming directly to our school district account, correct?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Parker.
I was going to say, so there are multiple CARES funds, and the money is filtered through the state, but then comes to the school district. The state controls kind of the processing, but it ultimately filters down to the school district.
So the 9.8 that our wonderful Congresswoman worked so hard to make sure we receive is currently where? At the state?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think people need to be aware of that because I think sometimes people think when these dollars come in that they're automatically coming into our bank account at the district, when in reality, we now have to wait for a process where we are going to be applying to the state to confirm that the state agrees on the different dollars that have been designated. We really need to make that clear because a lot of things get held at the state level. And I think it's so important for us to understand, especially when people talk about advocating and all of these other things, that it is our state government that is handling the distribution of those funds. So I don't want us to kind of pass that through and not make it clear to those who think that they would, as in Ms. Billington's opening statement, would advocate on behalf of the district. So just there's that. The other thing is in terms of personnel vacancies, were these all kind of various places where people retired and were not replaced? Or are these situations where there were open positions that were never filled, but we had budgeted for?
The teaching positions were retirements that we were projecting based on enrollment to not replace.
Okay, so my concern with that is that we be mindful of whether or not there are concentrations that would impact programming that people are counting on by these retirements not being replaced. So is there anything that needs to be highlighted? We need to have a conversation about that. Doesn't have to be here right now, but we need to be aware of any retirements that would then cause the jeopardizing of any programming because those positions are not replaced.
So with the recommendation, the academic team and the admin HR team kind of worked to look at the people who were retiring and which slots needed to be filled and which slots we could actually process a meaningful instructional environment if we didn't fill them. And that's kind of where we landed. So to your point, we have to be careful that if 8 math teachers are retiring, we don't leave 8 math vacancies open. So that processing has happened prior to the recommendation that's before you this evening. It's with that exact processing that you mentioned in mind.
So are there any programs that have been removed as a result of these vacancies?
No.
Okay, so all of the programs as we have known to exist in the 2019-2020 school year, we will see them continue in 2020 to 2021.
So I will give you yes with an asterisk. And
Okay.
here's your asterisk. We're budgeted to continue all of our programs. The asterisk is, and we'll talk a bit later on this evening about opening a school next year and what that means in terms of, number of kids that we can support in programs, number of kids that need to be operating in a virtual space. Like there are lots of other factors in COVID world that may come into play. So I don't want to give an absolute yes and then say, oh, we need to shift A, B, and C to support students who are at home versus in school. I think that's the variable. But if COVID weren't a concern and we were opening next school year with no issue as a regular normal school year, the answer to your question would be absolutely yes. Just caveat for how we address instructional needs with our opening of schools with COVID, because it may have to look a little bit different to meet the needs of our kids.
Okay, well, that's very important. I just want to make sure that we're not overlooking the fact that every single person on the board would want to be informed if any programs were impacted, that it would not be simply a matter of, handling vacancies and all of that, that we would want it to be brought to our attention. The other is, in terms of the TRAN, when that was voted on, there were some wiggle room, there was a savings. I'm just wondering if we did a hard look at those numbers that we anticipated the TRAN covering, and is there any part of that, I believe it was 30 million? Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, is there any part of that that could very well be surplus?
And Tara, help me out here if I go astray.
Okay.
So the TRAN, by the nature of its being, can't be surplus. It has to be paid back fully within its year. So we can't use that as extra revenue per se. Whatever you borrow has to be paid back fully within the school year.
We actually did a 9-month term, so it's not even, it's before the school year even ends. So this isn't a borrowing to have extra money. This is simply a borrowing to offset the rate at which we collect property tax.
Okay, well, that has to be made very clear, because there are some folks who might liken this to a home equity loan or something along those lines. And we just want everyone to understand that, let's say that you borrowed $20 and your hard look said, I may need $19.50 over the period of 9 months. But then through an adjustment, you come to find out that, oh, I will not be spending as much money on gas because I will not be traveling as much. So now I only need $15. Well, you already received the loan of the $20. My question is, in this particular instance, even though, yes, you're going to pay back $20 regardless, is there any distance between the 1950 and is there a $15 in an example I'm giving?
I think it better.
So in that example, you would not gain any of the other money back. The only savings that you would have is if the person you borrowed that $20 from charged you $2 in interest, then if you pay it back early, you only pay $1 in interest. You could realize that $1 back in terms of interest savings, but you won't ever get back any of the principal because the principal has to be paid back in full. It can't fold into your bottom line number.
So if I thought I needed $19.50 and now I only need $15 and I was given $20, you're saying that $450,
you're going to pay it back.
Yeah. So
you're still going to pay back the $20.
You're still going to have to pay it back to them.
Yeah, I think a better analogy than trying to parse the money out. You borrowed $20 from your friend. You may not have needed that whole $20, but you got some on Friday, you got to give your friend $20 back. They don't care how you spent it. They just want their $20 back on Friday. So I think that's a better way to look at it. So if you didn't spend it all, then you only have to give them, you're still going to give them back $20. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. Yes. So does that not give us any kind of float in some of these concerns that we're addressing right now, aside from just being able to meet our payments?
It just helps cash flow. It does not help your deficit bottom line number.
Okay. So then the other aspect is the salaries and benefits. I'm glad that we broke that out so that people don't look at it and say 315 million, is it 315 million of salaries and benefits without recognizing that 123 million of that is related to salaries. My question is, have we looked at the process that brings about, my understanding is that there are going to be some contractual obligations that are going to lead to increase in salary, just on general principle. So I just want to get clarification on the timeline of those increases on general principle and how they may be embedded in the salary number that we're looking at.
Can you be more specific? So we have all employees in the district have kind of a different structure for increase in salary or steps each year. So every employee group is on scale for whatever the contractual obligation for that group would be. Okay.
So I think it's important for the public to understand that there are certain contracts that entitle employees to increases based on the step process. And that sometimes people may say, well, you need to hold salaries, but sometimes it's the steps that are there, or it's that the contract period that exists that these things are done under, which leads me to my next point. But I just want to put that out there for the public to understand the different things that we have to consider when we're looking at ways to meet budget. Keeping in mind, we have kept every single job. And I think that that's very important for us to highlight as well. Now, in that whole discussion just now about some of these automatic increases, I want us to, in the future, give consideration to purchase professional and tech services. I think with the salaries, it's very easy to see immediately what the results are of those salaries. We see these people every day in our buildings. It's the purchase professional and tech services where I think as we evolve in this budget process that we now need to give a little more attention to. I think that right now where we're at, we're gonna just do what we're going to do. But I think going forward, when we are purchasing professional and technical services, we want to see more of a clarification and expectation, something along the lines of what we did with the transportation company. There were a number of people who were not satisfied, and then we took that into account, and then we did a whole process. You know, the same thing with our solicitor. We did a whole process. So it's not just transportation and the solicitor that has to answer to the public in terms of how the taxpayers' money is spent. It's also these purchase professional and technical services. So I'm just putting that out there for now, something for us to consider as we go into the next year. And last but not least, the Homestead Farmstead Act that we're getting ready to make some decisions on. Can we please clarify what the eligibility factors are? My understanding is it's seniors, but I don't know. I don't know for sure, because the Farmstead Act, I don't remember that being attached to the Homestead Act. So for the sake of our audience and those who are trying to understand how things work, can we clarify eligibility?
So I'm going to step in here and just ask that we wait for that question for that memo that comes up after this. If there's any other questions on this, the final budget, I'd like to just stick to that.
Well, that's a question for the final budget as well, but yes, we can wait until the next section. That's all I had on the budget.
Are there any other questions on the budget presentation?
I have one more question. Okay, so if we go with a 4% increase, which is $104, during this pandemic situation, even with our senior citizens, even with those people who are just trying to make ends meet, even the people who don't have a job anymore, who are, have gotten a mortgage deferment for the moment, how can we justify doing that to them? And we still don't have a curriculum. We still don't have an education curriculum. We still have problems, summer learning, virtual learning. How do we justify that?
Is that?
Yeah, how do we justify it?
So I would probably begin with a bit of a challenge to the assumption, right? So I don't know if I'd say there's no curriculum. I'd say that there's curriculum in place. Curriculum drives down through the state, through the standards, the materials that we use in the district to impart the information, share the information, work with our students. Those are our learning resources, but our curriculum is driven by the state, and we're in the process of reviewing and updating and improving based on our curriculum audit, right? So I think if there's a dichotomy that's built there, it's a bit mismatched, because there is a curriculum. We did an audit on the curriculum to ensure that we could focus and improve. And earlier this year, we actually laid out the elements of our instructional framework that are going to drive how we improve the curriculum in the district over time. So I hear what you're saying, and I understand, but I think to be kind of clear with saying that there is or is not a curriculum is really important there. And I think that's different from whether or not the district as a taxing authority takes its full local effort or half the local effort or whatever in the mix will be in terms of increasing the taxes for the school district to ensure that we have the financial ability to meet the needs of kids. Ultimately, there are only a few ways that school districts can increase revenue. That's kind of advocating, pushing, cajoling at the local and state levels to increase revenue over time. That is, different types of loan programs, whether it's a capital loan or a different type loan to increase revenue, or as the Commonwealth has identified, every school district has every school district has the ability to increase the local millage each year up to a certain amount. And for a district like Allentown, and we knew, 3 years ago, we had the data to show the trajectory of loss in fund balance that dates back to about 6-7 years. With that trajectory going this way, one of two things has to happen fairly significantly: either A, increasing revenue at a fairly extensive rate, or B, reducing expenses. If you reduce expenses, you have to look at your largest bucket areas. Over the past few years, I believe in each budget, there's been a reduction of people service in each budget in the past few years. So not the drastic reduction in people, but a gradual reduction in people over time, so that we have the ability to kind of keep our heads at water. What helps you pull over water when you're in a space where you don't have a fund balance is the ability to increase your tax base through raising that percentage. So I understand that it's a tough pill to swallow for homeowners in the city. I'm a homeowner in the city myself. I'm not at all happy about the fact that taxes may increase. I wasn't happy about taxes increasing last year with the city, but I also understand that there's kind of this collective responsibility that we all have to ensure, A, that the city operates, and B, that our school district operates and meets the needs of kids for the greater good, of my child, but of all children. So I think that collective responsibility is what we put out there as our city, our school district's role in ensuring that we take care of the children that we serve each and every day. I think there are a couple, if you get me on a roll, if you need me to stop, pull my arm, because I had a couple more to add in. So I think there's a couple of other things out there that to me are even more connected. The state flat funded school districts this year to the 1920 level. And we understand why. COVID is causing havoc in state budgets around the country. In the original proposed 1920 budget, that revenue number, and it was 124 million and some change. Flat funding is at 120 million. So there's a $4 million swing just in what our actual revenue will be next year and what the state in the governor's original budget had proposed to be in our final budget. So there's a $4 million swing just in what we get in our basic ed subsidy, a swing to the negative. There were a couple of other things that were in the proposed budget that would have, I think, been impactful for the district that we don't see in the budget that lays out currently, which again leads to the need for districts to take some of those measures to increase revenue or reduce expenses. There was charter school reform legislation that would have netted Allentown School District $3.9 million. So right there, there's $8 million in a chunk from the governor's proposed budget to what we now have that would have drastically impacted the district's need to increase the tax rate for the citizens here in Allentown. And then the third piece is, and it's a little bit harder to define it, but I think Tom Smith is on here somewhere. He'll probably give me a number. There was funding that was identified for RACP or RCAP, people say it both ways, to allow school districts the opportunity to engage that funding mechanism to pay for and mitigate certain building concerns. And with the number of old buildings that we have in the district, with the number of capital concerns that we have, we would have been able to save in the current budget on capital expenses that are now general fund expenses, as well as do some additional things that the school district would need, which would save money in facilities over time, had that funding mechanism come through. So if you look at kind of those 3-4 buckets in totality, there's a large portion of revenue that could have been sitting in our coffers that's now not sitting in our coffers. And the mechanism that the state has given school districts to kind of make up for that is raising taxes. So while it's absolutely not something that we want to see do and we'd like to do, it becomes critical for a district that has no fund balance to increase revenue in any way that it possibly can.
Okay, so we can do that, but we can also look at, I'm sorry, this is Allentown. You have many homeless. I said to my other board directors what the city looks like. I go there, we give out meals. It's going to get bigger if we do this 4%. It's going to get, that tent city is going to get bigger because people are going to lose their homes. They're going to lose rentals because landlords are going to make those rentals higher. So they can't, okay, so they can't decipher if they're going to, pay for food, pay for rent, live. How can we in good conscience, give this a 4% increase when people are taxed already? It's food insecurity and home insecurity, shelter insecurity. How do we do that in good faith and go to sleep? I can't. This has kept me up. I know what is out there for the regular people. You can say, Mr. Parker, no disrespect, you make, over $180,000 a year compared to people who are making $10 an hour. You got 2 or 3 people making that much, $10 an hour, so they can afford their $108,000 home. We can't. I can't equate both.
So I'll speak to that a little bit now, because and I joke with my kids about this. I tell them, don't be fooled. I wasn't born in a suit. I was born and raised on a farm in Mississippi in a hometown with 95 people, in a trailer house with a brother and a sister and 2 parents. My daddy never finished high school and my mama just finished. So I get it. I understand without question. So when you say regular people, the shirt and tie doesn't exclude me from understanding and valuing the experience of people that are here in our city. So I can't be any more authentic than that. I definitely understand and value what you're saying, but the shirt, tie, and the position is just people who have invested in opportunities for me over time. Right. I still understand and value those experiences from which I come and from the folks that we all advocate for each and every day, which is why I know and understand that if we don't continue to make investments in our educational system over time, we're going to continue to perpetuate poverty for a lot of folk who don't have the capacity to get out of poverty, that we have to advocate, push resources for them to be able to thrive and survive. And this isn't all of it, but this is a piece of it that becomes really critical for families to survive through education as a core principle in our country and in our city.
I just think we should be better stewards of the money that we have. Cut out consultants, cut out these things that, we don't necessarily need all the time, so that we can give our taxpayers a break. I mean, we ended up with a surplus. We learned last year when we were going through this, we were afraid of the fact that we wouldn't. But, lo and behold, things happen, we got a surplus. I can't do this in good conscience. I just can't. I don't see how any of us on this board can look at our city and see what's happening and in good conscience raise this 4%.
Yeah, and I hear you. I just want to, and I circled around this one earlier because I don't want us to be comfortable that we have a surplus. We are a deficit district. If you could see me dance on the table, I would. We are a deficit district. The reason that we have a fund balance in this budget is due to a $9.8 million infusion of CARES funds that's this year, with expenses that we don't know yet that may happen over next year. And this would still have us identified with a deficit going into next year. So we're not done. The resources from CARES allowed us to balance our budget for this year, but there's still a lot of work to do. And I get you, I'm with you. I just know that there's a lot of work to do to increase revenue in this district to the level that it needs to be so that we can maintain programs in the district over time. Because even with these numbers, this is with, I think, fairly small staffing in key places in the district.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Phoebe, do you have any other questions on the final budget?
I had to go back and say with the NISDA original contract, I was incorrect. It's 15 years.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Conover, I see your hand up. Is that a new question or is that from before?
This is a new question.
Okay, go ahead.
So I remember, Mr. Parker, when you first came on and you were explaining to us how we should understand, the numbers. I remember you said something to the effect. You said, I know that school districts will probably get rid of me for fiscal issues before they do it before educational. Maybe you didn't say it just like that, but you said that. And then I'm listening. I heard Miss Phoebe Harris. I'm sure everybody, the whole world knows how I feel about the tax increase. But I also heard her say that the rents and stuff are going to go up. Mm-hmm. What do you have to say to those families of the children? Because our district, we always talk about we have to feed the kids because our kids are underprivileged. We have to, we have over 800 homeless. What are we saying to the homeless? I know there's homeowners, because we talked about that before. You already, I don't have to say it again, Miss Phoebe. But what are we saying to these people who have one foot on a banana peel and then the other one, what are we saying? Because of this, not because of anything that they've done wrong. It's just that their city is becoming, or their school district and their city is pushing them out. What do we say at this point? Do we say we got to do the 4% because we have to turn something in so that it look like we're trying, and so that our district can get past this year? Because next year, like you already said, we already set the stage. This is just a fix for now. We got this CARES money that we didn't know we were going to get, but we got it, and this is just for now. We got to still move forward. What are we, not you by yourself, what are we saying to these people, to the people, our people? What are we saying to them? We're saying it's okay?
So my answer to that is, I think there are two things that we say to them. And if we say them loud, we say them consistently, we say them collectively, then we change the tone of the conversation, because we're sitting in a bucket together and kicking each other over what's in the bucket, when the reality is the bucket should be larger. So we can continue to kick each other over how we allocate what's in the bucket, or we can focus on ensuring that the bucket meets the needs of what we have. Funding for the school district overall, that's what we need to tell our folk, is that we as a collective body, as a superintendent, as a board, are going to advocate, push for the appropriate funding that we need to support school children in this city at the same level as children in the cities that surround us. We also need to make sure that in the mix of funding, we include a couple of things. One, what's the overall mechanism for increasing funding to school districts that are in places like ours? And two, the charter school calculation. And again, I'll say it again, not anti-charter. I'm talking about the calculation for how the rate is created. Either address the calculation so that it's less impact to the school district, or return to, I think it was it 30% or 33% that school districts used to receive back on the amount paid in tuition. So I think the conversation has to shift if we're going to have this conversation honestly, openly, and effectively. The two big buckets that are impacting are there. There's another big bucket. It's a little bit smaller, but just as significant. Our rising cost in educating students that have IEPs is, I think, at a higher trajectory than most other districts across the Commonwealth. So the next lever that we need to advocate and push is for resources to support students that have IEPs. We can be at this place as a board and as a superintendent every year. We're going to kick each other around in the same bucket every year over the few resources that we have at our disposal, or we can choose to advocate higher, push further, and identify additional resources so that we can meet the needs of kids without kicking each other over the few dollars that we do have in the district, because this is just a merry-go-round that goes around and around and around over time. If you don't significantly increase revenue, then ultimately you have to decrease expenses. And there aren't many places in this district where we can significantly decrease expenses without having huge impact to kids. So I don't think it's a tax argument conversation. I think that is an outgrowth of the larger conversation, which is really around the revenue points for urban school districts and how we as a school district advocate for the resources that we need. I'll circle back to the letter that I sent out about 2 weeks ago. As we talk about where we are as a nation, as we push social justice, for me and my role and my space and my advocacy, how do we push social justice as leveling the playing field with the resources that are available to educate children in Black and brown communities? Because the communities that don't look like us aren't having this argument about survival. They may be having arguments about fund balance and raising taxes to support fund balance, but we're having an argument about base survival. And until we challenge those larger constructs of revenue, we're going to continue to be in this circle, because that's the only fix. Drastically increase revenues or drastically decrease expenses.
Thank you, Mr. Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Parker.
Lisa, any other questions about the final budget?
Thank you, Mr. Parker.
I get excited.
No, you answered. That was the answer to the question, but I was just closing it out. No, I do not.
Okay. Seeing no other hands, can I entertain a motion to move this to tonight's board meeting?
So moved.
Second.
Audrey?
Audrey, second by Nancy. Wilt, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed?
Nay.
Okay, motion passes. Okay, now we already had the presentation for the homestead and farmstead. So I know there was one question on that. Mr. Johnson Watts, did you want to ask that question now?
Who is eligible for the homestead, farmstead provision?
You have to, there's an application for a homestead farmstead exclusion on the Lehigh County website. You have to fill out that application and submit it to the county.
Isn't there an age requirement involved?
There is a property tax relief for senior citizens and low income, but that's not this.
Okay, well, if we're not able to answer that question right now, I think we should post that information with a link on our website as a service to the people who are going to have to deal with this.
Okay.
I'll just take a step back. Tara, was there any other parts of that that you want to present it, or you guys already covered what you needed to?
I think I pretty much covered what we need to. I'm happy to answer questions if there are any more.
Okay. My colleagues, any other questions on the homestead and farmstead exclusions? Okay, seeing none, I'm gonna move to vote on both of these. Solicitor, Mr. Forn, I believe I can do that, right? We can vote on both these right now.
Certainly.
The resolution and the calculations.
Again, these are calculations that are essentially not our calculations, but calculations given to us by the state. So it's kind of a formality, but yes, you can vote on both of them, certainly.
Okay. I will entertain a motion for moving the homestead exclusion calculations and the resolution to the board meeting.
So moved.
Okay. Ms. Wilt, do I have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Mrs. Brace. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay. Resolutions passed to the board meeting. I will pass it over to Mr. Thiel for comments.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Do we have any comments from the public on non-agenda items? Seeing no comments from the public on non-agenda items, is there any old business? Is there any new business or grass catcher items?
Yes.
Yes, Ms. Harris.
Yes, I was going to go back with, well, it's not going back. One of the things I noticed, and I've been noticing lately, is that our baseball fields and softball fields are being used unauthorized. What are our ramifications for that? Do we have a policy that says, you know, what we can do, what we can't do when we see that happening at our baseball and softball fields?
What would you give me your question one more time? Sorry.
Oh, okay. Our baseball and softball fields
Mm-hmm.
are being used, being unauthorized, you know, not getting authorization to use them. We are putting quite a bit of money into those fields. People are ruining them because they're not authorized to use them, especially our baseball fields when they turn them into softball fields, because they're moving second base inwards into the grass area. So what are do we have a policy, or do we have something where, you know, where we either call the police or, you know, or we go to them? What is the policy for unauthorized use of getting these people off our field?
So not with the kind of clear policy in my pocket right now. We can look that up for you. I'm gonna make sure we get it to you. Traditionally, if we do have folk that are using facilities, whether it's the athletic fields or parking lots or et cetera, that are unauthorized, then we are able to make contact with, you know, our internal security staff through operations, and if necessary, make contact with APD to have conversation with those individuals. Similar to the situation from this weekend, we made contact with APD, and then they kind of communicate with the folk that are on property from there.
Do we have no trust? I didn't see anywhere, so I'm looking. Do we have no trespassing signs on there? And if you do trespass, this is what's going to happen.
I couldn't say for each property, but I see my ADs are on with us today, as well as operations. So I'll definitely shoot that information down, and they'll process it and make sure we're appropriate.
Okay, so if we don't have that, then would that go to the athletic policy committee, or where would it go to make sure that we can have, you know, signage out there at our fields, in our parking lots as well? Because Building 21 parking lot gets used all the time. Trucks get parked there, and that they shouldn't be there.
And when that happens, we make contact with APD, or our facilities department has sometime gone out and spoken to them and asked them to move. And we've had pretty good success with people moving along when we identify it.
Okay. Well, like I said, can we ask and make sure, see if we need to get signage out to there?
Yeah, Mr. Falco is on, and I'm looking at both my ADs.
Okay.
They will support to make sure that he can get that processed.
Thank you, because we pay way too much money for those fields to maintain them and to keep them. Those are for our students, and those are for, you know, city wants to use them. That's a contract with us. I'm not happy with someone else using them, unauthorized, and messing up those fields for our children when our children need them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Thank you, Ms. Harris. Any other items under new business and grass catcher? Seeing none, entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Mrs. Johnson Watts.
Second.
Who is second? Ms. Harris?
Yeah.
Second, Ms. Harris. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you, everybody. And that concludes our Finance Committee of the Whole meeting for this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Thiel. Now I'd like to call to order the special board meeting of the Board of Directors of the School District for the City of Allentown for today, June 29th, 2020. We will now have roll call. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Mrs. Brace.
Here.
Mrs. Conover.
Yes. Present.
Mrs. Wilt.
Here.
Mrs. Johnson Watts.
Here.
Miss Matheson.
Here.
Miss Vega.
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Here.
Mr. Thiel.
Here.
Miss Harris.
Here.
9 board members are present.
Thank you. Please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of
The United States of
America.
and
And
to the republic
stands
for which it stands,
under God,
One nation
Lord,
under God.
liberty, justice.
Justice for all.
Thank you. You may be seated. As we move through our agenda here and we get ready to do the actual adoption of our budget for this year, I just want to make a general statement that I'm sure there will be amendments proposed, and just a reminder that any significant cuts to the budget on the revenue side should follow with something on an expense side to match it up. So it's easy to say, let's cut, but then you have to think about what are you going to cut on the expense side. So I just want everybody to keep that in their mind. I know it's a tough decision that we have to make tonight, and I know that nobody here is just making decisions for the sake of making decisions. We've all been reading up on all the information. Mr. Parker, do you have any comments or remarks?
Yeah, I actually do have just a few remarks, and I think I'm a bit reflective today as we end what for me is my 3rd year in Allentown, opening the 4th year with a lot of work behind us and a lot of work ahead of us. So I'm really reflective, and I'm probably a little bit feisty this week. My staff will tell you, because I'm excited about kind of where we are and where we're going to go. And in the midst of, continually processing how to engage voice and how to be a part of a movement for social justice in our nation, as a school district, as a superintendent, as a Black man in this country, I couldn't help but reflect and do a little bit of research over the past few days that kind of codified what I believed based on our principles, but something that we just don't often put the numbers to. We are kind of nose to the grind doing work in this district. We don't spend lots of time celebrating, but there's a few things that I just like to kind of put there so that ourselves, our community, our board kind of sees and understands that the commitment to ensuring success for our kids is larger than what we see in a moment and has been a part of the way that we've worked over time. So just one piece of data that I like to share. One of the key concerns that our district had a number of years ago was that in our district, leaders, and specifically leaders of color, were not represented and did not have place, opportunity, and position in our district. So I want to share a few numbers. In ASD, when I arrived 3 years ago, we had one assistant principal of color in our middle schools. We now have 4. We had one principal of color at the high school level. For the first time, we have 3 principals that all represent different cultures as a part of the Allentown School District family. I believe we had 2 high school principals of color. We now have 4. We also have additional leaders in the pipeline from assistant principal to principal, but also at the dean of student level and in our Lehigh University program with preparing future leaders. We have 2 leaders of color there that are preparing to walk into the light of leadership in our district. When I arrived, we had 2 people of color at the central office level at admin. There have been 8 since I've been here over the past 3 years. And each of the leaders at the level of superintendent above represents diversity. So that commitment to social justice, the commitment to ensure that Black Lives Matter in this district and in this city, I would say I would challenge the Allentown School District's commitment to leadership diversity against any organization in the city of Allentown. There's a lot of work to do as we close out the 3rd year for me and move into the next year. But I would be remiss if I did not applaud the leaders in our district. And I'll begin with the board, who has made that commitment again and again and again to excellence and also diversity. That's the theme that has been here from day one and continues to be the commitment of this board. So let's celebrate this board having that commitment, the leaders that do this work in the Allentown School District every day and understand that diversity is important, diversity is critical. We don't have to talk about it each and every day, but there's great work happening in this district to ensure that we're meeting the diverse needs of our students. Our curriculum audit, our the Skyward audit, our fiscal audit, all foundational documents that are leading to the work that is happening to meet the needs of kids. Even through fiscal restraints, we're still working and making great decisions to meet the needs of kids in this district. So I want to applaud first the vision of this board. And again, I can't speak to boards before me. I can only speak to the time I arrived and move forward. The vision that this board has had and committed to diverse leaders that bring diverse perspectives to the school district, and the leaders in this district, both diverse and non-diverse, that have committed to the ideals with our strategic framework and continue even in the continual face of fiscal challenges to drive out quality instructional environments for kids. There's work to do. We're going to continue to do that work. But this is one moment that I can say our district has committed, has done the work. We may not be celebrating it and yelling it to the highest hills in the nation, but I will put our data and our record against any district in the state and any organization in the city in terms of diversity and leadership in Allentown. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. At this time, if there's anyone from the public who would like to speak on agenda items, now is the time to raise your hand and you will be recognized. Robert Smith. Oh.
1060 East Gordon Street, Allentown, PA. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so budget and you can get it down to 2.5% without making one cut. So at least get it down to 2.5%. I heard you, Madam President, what you said. Salaries were not frozen at all on the administrative level. Mr. Parker, those were great words you said, but even last year, you cut your salary 1%. I think at least the increases could have been frozen this year on the administrative level. Consultants, Madam President, consultants. It seems no matter how tough the budget is, the consultants always get their millions of dollars. That is another area where you can cut automatically. The community school. I haven't heard one penny of revenue on this rental of the community school. This is extra revenue. I'm not saying we don't need a tax increase, but have we done every single thing to increase revenue and cut costs? And Madam President, we have not. That is extra revenue that could be added to the budget so taxpayers do not have to have an increase of 4%. Community school. Also, again, I'll bring it up again because it's been going on for 16 plus years. Revenue at the stadium, revenue signs in the gyms, advertising outside the high schools. These are all revenue sources that we could be selling, naming rights to the gyms, naming rights to the stadium, all revenue sources. Also, the property of the two old schools could be sold for revenue sources to avoid a 4% tax increase. And yes, Mr. Parker, we need to go to the state. The formula for Allentown is a disgrace. What the governor did in cutting our budget, $8 million, is reprehensible and unconscionable. But we also have to look out for the taxpayers in this city. And we can lower this tax increase of $100 to senior citizens on this street. We talk about medical. We talk about food. We talk about their Social Security payments getting $10 or $15 increases, and we're going to increase it $104. Please, my fellow board members, lower it to $60 at least for these senior citizens. The hardworking people of the district that you're talking about for the students, you're hurting the parents of the same students that you want to help. These parents have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to pay the taxes. Please don't do this to the parents of the students if you want to help. You're hurting the parents of the students. I urge you to lower the tax increase. Yes, and I believe it should go up incrementally. That's 2.5%. You're still in the black, and you also can make these cuts and revenue enhancements throughout the year. Thank you, Board. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Sharon Billington.
Sharon Billington, 1509 Chew Street. I would just like to remind the board that due to the fiscal mismanagement of administration and previous administrations and previous boards, that is why we are at the point we are at now. Because it was politically popular not to raise taxes for 5 years running, and then another 2 years after a little bit of an increase. You see what mess that got the city into. We're in the same boat. We need to be far-sighted, not short-sighted like we have been. We knew these changes were coming 15, 20 years ago regarding demographics and needs of special education, and nothing was done because it didn't need to be addressed or brought out in public. It could be hidden away. These are things that are going to constantly keep increasing and that we have to constantly keep being prepared for. Do I think taxes should be raised every year? Yes, in a small increment like they should have been. But because we never did that, we dug ourselves deeper and deeper. Boards and administrations took from our fund balance. Why, I don't know, because if you pull from a savings account and do not put any money back in, it's not going to automatically or miraculously be there. These are the things that we need to constantly look at. And when I hear one more time about our children not getting anything, well, then it's up to the board to make sure they get it. And that has to come from revenue. That has to come from interacting with other boards across the Commonwealth. That has to come with all these boards going to Harrisburg. That has to come with going to our federal government and having them pass the Restore American School Act, fully fund the IDEA. These are things that are languishing in our governments that are not going anywhere due to politics. I implore the board not to fall into the politically popular decisions. You have to make the hard decisions if you want our children to succeed. You have to make the hard decisions if you want to reduce the amount of poverty in Allentown. Yes, that takes money, that takes sacrifice, and that takes all of us supporting each other in this. I do think a 4% is needed. Most homes are not assessed at the amount they're talking about. Most row homes are even below that by quite a bit. So yes, this is something that we all need to pull together, and we need to support our children. They are our future. We are their future. We can't forget that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Billington. Seeing no other hands raised for public comment, we will move on to the superintendent's report. Mr. Parker, did you want to present anything before we make a motion to adopt any of this report?
Sorry, thank you. I had to unmute. So I will begin, and then I'm going to pass the proverbial microphone to Dr. Brown. And so there are a couple of pieces that will be a part of the conversation this evening. The first piece will be an update on our processing and planning for opening of schools, some of our best thinking, as well as the work that the pandemic coordinating team under Dr. Brown's leadership is doing in the district. And the second piece will be actually for approval, which will be our school district safe athletics health and safety plan. As you know, athletics begins prior to the school year. So we've been working with the Department of Education, as all school districts, to develop the health and safety plan to support our student athletes through the summer months, even before the return to school in the fall. Dr. Brown, are you queued up for the update on opening of schools?
I just need to be able to share my screen. If I have those capabilities, I will be able to do so. All right. As Mr. Parker mentioned, we are intending to share with our school board of directors and our community our initial and preliminary thinking on our opening of schools planning. And then later on, you'll hear from Mr. Falco, our director of operations, the athletic health and safety plan that will be brought before you as well. First and foremost, actually, Mr. Parker, this was sort of where you would sort of set the tone and explain how you charged our pandemic coordinating team with your design elements.
Thank you. So I guess this graphic really describes the process that we're going through to identify what will happen next year. And I'll begin with the end in mind. Nobody knows fully what September will bring. We believe that we'll be in green, and we're going to operate developing a plan for green. But as we've seen over the past few days, there are a number of states that are seeing spikes. Just today, Tennessee, their governor extended their state of emergency. I was doing some reading that there are some establishments in Pittsburgh that are closing because they're seeing COVID spikes. So all of this is tenuous, and we're planning, and I'll begin at the bottom, for flexibility. I think that's the key. This is not a plan. It is the framework for our thinking in developing a flexible plan to support high quality instruction for all students in the district for the next school year. That's key. We're going to be flexible, and the goal is to ensure that we have high quality instruction for all. In doing so, we have to make sure that we focus on safety. First and foremost is a safe school environment. That is in our strategic framework. It's our core, one of the core principles that we're building the work on. And the other core principle is family engagement. These are not decisions that can be made in isolation. These are decisions that are going to have to be made in consultation with our stakeholders and the people that we're serving. We need to know, either through survey and or through direct contact and conversation, what our families and communities want and need going into next school year, so that we can best provide them in that customer service type format. And all of those things kind of focused around a central core of communication. And that's two-way communication to and with our families, so that we're really clear around what their goals, needs are, and they can be really clear from us what the resources and opportunities that exist are in the school district. And at the very top of the page, one thing that I will underline, circle, highlight, put in italics and everything else is, as a part of whatever option we put in place, we're going to have a robust virtual learning option for any and all students and parents that are not comfortable with their children returning to school buildings. So there's a spectrum, and Dr. Brown will get to this, of what the return to school could look like. And we could be in different places on the spectrum, but the one standard that we will absolutely hold in place is a virtual learning option for all students. We started last year with Mr. Singh and the Virtual Academy team, really building up our Virtual Academy in ASD. Did some great work last year transitioning a program that had previously been just for high school students to bring middle school students on as well. So in the next phase and iteration, we will be offering fully K-12 virtual options for our parents. We want our families to know that they should be right here in the Allentown School District, and we have the capacity to provide at a very high level whatever type of instruction they need, and we'll have that in place as a part of the overall plan in the fall. But that piece is underscored, circled, highlighted, and everything else, because that's core when we think about our flexibility. It is about flexibility and options. So with that, Dr. Brown, thank you.
Right. And so keeping all of that in the background of our planning and our thinking, we'd also like to share with our board and our community the influences on this work at the federal, state, and local levels. If you read from left to right, you'll see that first and foremost, and I'm in the middle of the slide, we're guided by CDC guidelines. Our team meets frequently to process and synthesize through those CDC guidelines, determine what's applicable and how we can meet those expectations within our planning. Every one of our cabinet members and probably triple score for our superintendent in being involved in a number of regional task force at the state level, the IU level, and again, our department leaders are involved as well. And we bring all of that information back to our district level working group, and again, meet, process, synthesize, poke holes through the information, all aimed at the task of determining what's best for our families and what can we reasonably do. We've turned this information back around to our principals so that our principals can begin to mimic our practices and tease out their own building level plans as we think about opening of schools. Number 5, our community partners. It was just Friday that we convened a group of 35 community partners virtually, simply to do the same thing that we're doing here tonight, explain to them our thinking and rationale behind our planning processes, and allow them time and space to comment and identify any concerns that they may have as they align with us and support us in whatever our opening of schools comes to be. Our families and staff, we're using our families and staff as a critical stakeholder group as they are. We've disseminated surveys out to both of those groups. Additionally, just Friday, we issued an open call, if you will, for families to voluntarily register to be a part of our family and parent opening of schools discussion group. We left it open for a short amount of time, and we yielded 21 families that we are going to assemble and have some anecdotal discussions about some of the data that we'll share during our data snapshot in this presentation. And I'll go back up to the 3 bullets that are at the top of this slide. I touched on our central office staff, our weekly planning, our surveys. Our family survey went out June 12th and remains open at this point. We pushed links out on the app, posted links on our website, and we have also partnered with La Mega radio station to promote English and Spanish versions of messages to encourage our families to complete the survey. Our staff survey was disseminated on June 19th. And as of today's date, we have about 2,000 staff members who've responded. And so that kind of gives you an idea of the strands of the work and the key working groups that are involved in this planning process. A bit about our timeline. And again, this solely speaks to the month of June. It started at the beginning of the month, June 3rd, in fact, with our State Department of Education releasing some very comprehensive guidance for the opening of schools, but also requiring each LEA, or local school district, if you will, to identify a pandemic coordinator, as well as any supporting teams to support the individual in that role. That is the role that I'm serving in until I tell myself throughout the duration, until there's no longer a need. From there, our internal working group was identified and convened. That working group includes district leadership representation from facilities, food services, HR, academics, technology, as well as each level of the SUPES office, beginning with Mr. Parker and then supporting with Jen Ramos. Again, I spoke to the survey dissemination dates. Friday the 26th was our community task force that was convened, and that brings us up until this evening, where we're presenting and outlining our framework for our opening of schools and sharing a snapshot of our survey data that was culled most recently. Some of the key considerations that each of our departments need to, or we keep at the forefront of our planning and our discussion, is first and foremost health and hygiene protocols. Secondarily, student need, academic and non-academic. We're going to be delving deeper into building readiness, but we've started those conversations. What does hallway and directional flow look like? What do social distance classrooms look like? We're talking about staff training dependent upon role and any sort of modifications to roles that we'll need to have. Scheduling, when we get into our scenarios for opening of schools, the implications of scheduling, particularly at the secondary level. Technology, resource allocation, and survey data. So all of our scenarios and our thinking keeps these key considerations at the forefront. Now here's an initial data point from our survey. Important to note, our survey findings are not complete yet. As I mentioned earlier, our survey remains open, and it will remain open until probably the end of July. We have summer school starting today, so we envision that we'll be able to get more parents to complete as time goes on. But in this initial data polling, if you will, that represents approximately 1,500 households, you can see, and the initial question was, we're considering a number of options for opening our buildings. Do you feel comfortable sending your student to school? And you can see it's almost split, with the majority of our families responding, no, they're not, and then 45% saying that yes, they are. We wanted to ask, if you're not comfortable sending your child back in the fall, please share with us why. And the highest ranked response was, our families are concerned that health and safety protocols would not be followed. So that circles back to that primary consideration in that list of key considerations that I shared. We have to be cognizant and remain steadfast with health safety protocols, because our families are depending on us to enforce and follow these protocols. Next, we wanted to ask what their primary work concerns were with returning to school. And you can see they're ranked numerically from 1 through 7, but the top 3 fall right back into that health and safety protocol bucket, if you will. Disinfecting processes for classrooms and other student gathering places, public health regulations being followed, and then third, availability of disinfecting materials or PPE. We then wanted to ask our families, just to put some feelers out and hear from them, an idea of what educational delivery option they could most support for their student this fall. We listed 3 scenarios, one where we had an on-time start with some of our students in the building and some remaining at home for distance learning. The second option was an on-time start through distance learning and then scaffolding in or moving into buildings when safe or at strategic marker points. And then lastly, an on-time start in buildings with a move to distance learning if needed, meaning if there's a COVID breakout in buildings or in the district or a broader county. And as you can see, out of that small sampling that we gathered, the results are pretty split, with the highest ranking option for that hybrid option, where some of our students are in the building for an on-time start and some are remaining at home for a virtual learning experience. From there, we felt it important to note and to begin to develop messaging and ideas around what would the different types of virtual learning look like, because it's obvious from our data, it's confirmed through the superintendent's vision that we offer this robust learning environment. And so we want to begin to start the conversations about what that looks like. And a robust virtual learning environment is typically comprised of a synchronous and asynchronous learning environment. On the left, I won't read that for you, but the synchronous environment is teacher-led, typical what you would find in your brick and mortar, and then asynchronous is student directed. And why we make that delineation is because it's very evident that our teachers, our instructional staff are going to have to balance between both so that students have that flexibility that Mr. Parker mentioned, and that our district has that flexibility should we have to close our buildings down during the school year and move everything online. We've now prepared for it at the onset, as opposed to having to scramble and be reactive. And so we'll get this messaging out to our families as well as we convene and discuss with them. So how will virtual learning impact our students and community? And I won't read through all of them, but as you can see, there's a role for each person that touches upon our student learning experience, with the students at the center. And one of the primary core tenets, if you will, and it goes back to our strategic framework, this whole idea of anytime, anywhere learning. Now, we identified that in our framework 2-3 years ago, not really understanding what that meant, but knowing that it was rooted in flexibility and student autonomy, if you will. And so here we are today, trying to make the best of a crisis and using this as an opportunity to provide that continuous learning experience that can be personalized for our students, all under the semblance of our instructional framework, which we've shared, and our ASD instructional practices. And the roles that you see that are circling the student, there is a training role for each of those roles in this virtual learning environment. So it's not enough to say we're doing virtual learning, it's going to be synchronous and asynchronous. We are even now teasing out, what does the professional development look like for each of these roles, our families, even our partners? How do we build their capacity to support us on this endeavor? Our principals, our district leaders, and of course, our teachers. We're talking about our virtual learning, our environments and what they require, because it's important that as we engage and prepare our families to support their students, that they understand this whole notion of self-directed learning and what it means to be brick and mortar simultaneously, while also what it means to be virtual. Because within that flexibility paradigm, we are going to have to oscillate between both environments, and it's imperative that we do so seamlessly and with as little error and angst, if you will, as possible. And so we want to keep at the forefront of our conversations these 5 elements of time, space, routines, communication, and accountability. And you can see how the student will be empowered and supported to play more of a lead role in the virtual environment versus the brick and mortar, where our teachers will remain in the lead role there. Another question we asked in our survey, actually, this is the same question, so I'll advance to the next slide. We asked our families, when did they identify the most frequent time that their students were participating in live sessions with their teachers via Zoom or Google Classroom? And as you can see, the top response from that small sampling was in the afternoon. So our students and our teachers were more active and had more interaction during the afternoon. And that's another key point of consideration when we determine flexibility for our students and our teachers. You can see the lower response rates were morning, and then some students who did not experience live sessions. And that's just a point of research for us, number 2, to determine where did we have live sessions, and also build out a standard for when live sessions will be required, and what are those expectations at the classroom level, the virtual classroom level. Now, this question asked our families, what time of day did their student most frequently complete assignments? So now we've moved away from the live environment and talking about really that student autonomy piece. When were students more engaged independently? And the research or the findings show that our students were more independent and more engaged in completing assignments in the morning, which is key, again, as we're thinking flexibility and building out a subsequent schedule for what a virtual learning day would look like for a student. We went back to safety protocols, but this time we asked the question a little differently. Here we asked, if your students were to participate in a face-to-face or hybrid learning environment, and a hybrid being them going in and out of the building, so an alternate day schedule, what would be some of the safety protocols that you would expect to be in place? And here, again, ranked from 1 to 9, the highest expectation our families had would be that we perform temperature checks daily of students and families, that we acquired signage to remind our staff and students of proper hygiene, our staff wearing face coverings and masks, that we restrict areas where large gatherings occur, and then the 5th most responded to option was students being kept 6 feet apart in all areas. So I guess I'll slow down. I'm at my last slide, but what I will share is we are taking all of that information, and these are our next steps. We will continue to monitor our family survey for trends in the data as we bring the survey to a close at the end of July. We will convene our opening of schools parent group and hear directly from our parents to follow up on some of these data points that we've captured from the survey. We will launch our comprehensive communication plan, and we'll share that out with you. That involves sharing our messaging out on all forms of social media, print media, any way that we can to inform our families and keep them in the know, if you will, of what our opening of schools could look like. We intend to open a virtual learning registration in early July. That will allow our families to opt in of a virtual learning environment so that we're not choosing initially who gets to stay in the brick and mortar environment and who goes into the virtual. We had a very high response, as you saw early on, with a large majority of our families wanting the virtual option. So our thinking is that we will let them opt into that to suit their preference. We will finalize our department and building level plans by mid-July. We will conduct building readiness visits, and that will be to determine how our principals are coming along in the progress of preparing their buildings for opening of schools. We will continue to plan and offer professional development. And then lastly, we will finalize and submit our opening of schools plan, which is due to our State Department of Education the end of July. And that is based on us bringing the final plan back to the board as well, just as we have Mr. Falco presenting the final health and safety athletic plan this evening. And so I will conclude there and make myself available for any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Since this is not an action item, do any board members have any questions on the information that was presented?
So one more thing before we go to question, and it's to link to the question that Ms. Johnson Watts asked earlier about program maintenance from last year to this year. This is just to kind of link back to, as we go through this process, this is what I was speaking to in terms of where some shifts may be based on need, but not defunding programs during the budget process, but the need may shift based on how we proceed.
Okay, thank you. I have some questions, but I'll let board members go first. Ms. Harris, do you have one?
Yeah, I do. Mr. Parker, this is a extensive plan. I like it. I think it's really thinking inside the box, outside the box, around the box, everywhere. So my question is to you is this going to be part of Dr. Brown's responsibilities now while this is going on?
Yes, part of her responsibilities, my responsibilities, everybody has a role to play. Dr. Brown is coordinating the pandemic team, but each of us has a role to play in this work.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions from board members? I have a question, maybe a couple, I'm not sure, we'll see. So if a parent selects that they want their child to be virtually taught, so they're going to be just fully enrolled in the virtual platform, is there some type of something that we're going to do that holds the parents responsible for making sure their child is doing the work on a timely manner? Not so when we had to shut down in March, we obviously wanted the kids to work, but it became a pass-fail option. I can't imagine that we can continue pass-fail starting the new school year if parents are opting in to virtually teach their children. Well, not teach, but that their child participates in the virtual platform. So is there some way that we will hold parents accountable for that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the components that I didn't mention within the asynchronous learning environment, the virtual learning environment, in addition to the curriculum that is provided through the educational platforms, there will be opportunity for students to demonstrate mastery through the identification of options on playlists or choice boards. And there will be accountability built into those areas and possibly some other areas, but we're still teasing it out. The idea is that your virtual learning experience is just as rigorous, if not, well, I would say evenly as rigorous, if not more, because it's student driven without any barriers or restriction as your brick and mortar experience, which means there has to be accountability. But we want to also make it something that is understandable and achievable for the student and the family, if that helps.
Okay, and then thinking on the teacher side, so I am back in my classroom, and I can tell you it is incredibly stressful in COVID classroom. So for our teachers, if they're going to be required to have children virtually taught and potentially teaching children in a classroom, are you planning in this plan to have that set aside, that a teacher is potentially maybe only teaching in the morning, then they have the afternoon to do their virtual stuff? Not that our teachers are going to be expected to teach their normal day and then hop on in virtual things?
Sure. Now we're waiting on information from PDE to let us know if we're held to the requisite instructional minutes. If we're not held to that, then we're able to adjust the daily schedule. And there is a model circulating in the Lehigh Valley where teachers are teaching face-to-face, a certain portion of their day, maybe 2 to 3 hours, and then the rest of the day have their prep period and then virtual teaching. So once we hear back from PDE on what the expectation is with regard to instructional minutes, we will be able to better tease out what our model can look like.
Okay, and then the last one is if we end up that we require that teachers need to come into schools to teach, will we include in our plans some way if a teacher does contract COVID and needs to be out of the district for an extended amount of time, whether it's a 2-week quarantine phase or potentially longer if they are hospitalized for it, that they're not penalized in any way because they were made to put in the school to teach?
Sure.
I don't know how to ask that, but that's they only have a certain amount of time that they can use. So is that going to be part of the plan to discuss that?
That would be a part of our protocol. And I know Mr. Pigeon is on and he may want to add to that, but that comes under his shop and he's definitely supporting us as we tease that HR staffing sort of protocol piece out. I don't know, Tony, if you want to add anything.
So the federal government has created a couple new leaves to support people, and one of them guarantees somebody 12 days of paid leave time, not their sick time, but of paid leave time. So that would play into this case. Also, the FMLA has been restructured for COVID. That would again give somebody some additional time for if they meet the requirements under the FMLA. Again, it's not full pay, but I believe it's 2/3 pay at that point. So that will also play into that. But yes, that will definitely be in our considerations as we move forward.
And those are all through. They're all. I know some of them had deadlines. Do those go all the way through the year?
I believe both of those go through the end of December. So the calendar year, not the school year.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. All right. That's all I had. Do any other board members have any other questions? All right, seeing no hands or any voices, we can move on to the athletics health and safety plan. Are you presenting anything with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, if we could, everybody has a copy of the plan itself. We were going to discuss several components of the plan, and there was a comparison chart that if we could share that on the screen. If you could share the spreadsheet. Thank you. This plan, just a few comments before we begin. As Mr. Parker said, both of our high school ADs, athletic directors, are with us this evening. Randy Attia from Allen High School and Dave Stout from Deerfield High School. With us tonight also is Amy Cotter. She's a lead trainer for St. Luke's Hospital. This plan is designed to initiate athletes returning and preparing for sport in a non-competitive preseason format. The plan is designed to structure practices and help athletes and coaches adjust to this new COVID-19 world we live in. Also, we'll know that this is a living document and will be evaluated and amended to reflect any new guidelines and regulations that emerge. This plan follows the guidance provided to by PDE and is required prior to conducting sports-related activities with students. This plan must be approved by our board and be posted on our district's website. The National Federation of High School Sports has initiated a phased reentry approach, which our plan also follows. These phases allow for progressing resocialization of sport as indicated in the documents on pages 11 through 15. Once approved, this plan will be reviewed during a mandatory meeting with our head coaches and assistants. On the spreadsheet that you see, there are several key areas that we're going to discuss and emphasize. If there are any questions along the way, please, by all means, ask. Dave Stout is going to present the education and awareness portion of our plan. Dave?
Good evening, all. Dave Stout here, Dear Athletic Director. I'm here to talk about the education and awareness portion of the plan. First off, prior to starting any workouts, coaches must be trained. All athletic staff will be trained specifically on protocols outlined in this document. This training will be done in 2 parts. Coaches will be required to take coronavirus awareness course through Safe Schools platform. Coaches will have to attend the meeting to review this plan, which will be conducted by the school's ADs and the respective athletic trainers of each school. Coaches will be educated in the following areas. 1, screening of athletes prior to workouts, in-session guidelines and protocols, and post-session protocols. Prior to the first workout, all athletes will be educated by the coaches, trainers, and athletic directors on the following as well. What they are to do if they are sick, which can be seen in Appendix 10 on page 32. We will educate our student athletes on masking and social distancing as outlined on page 7, along with reviewing pages 30 through 40 found in the plan, COVID education resources, which deal with prevention, hand hygiene, mental health, and aspects of returning to activity following inactivity. We feel that this plan, the most important part about this plan, or one of the most important parts, is educating everybody involved and making them aware of everything that needs to be followed in order to keep our athletes safe. That's what I have.
Thanks, Dave. A major part of the plan is also the health screening procedures. Amy is going to walk us through the pre-screening procedures. Amy?
Good evening, everyone. One of the first things we're going to do is have all staff and student athletes complete a one-time pre-screen questionnaire. That you'll find that in Appendix 4 and 5. Included in that is contact information in case we have any issues that we need to contact a parent, COVID-related questionnaire, and then also we require if an athlete or staff has a previous COVID diagnosis, we would recommend a written clearance for them to return to play. And that is just a one-time thing. On a daily, on page 8 of the plan, there'll be a daily on-site screening prior to entry. This will be most likely conducted by the athletic trainer on staff. Masks are required, and obviously social distancing during the screening process is also required. This daily questionnaire is 3 questions, and you can find that on Appendix 6. We prefer to have the questions answered electronically using a QR code that each athlete will receive. This will prevent congestion at the screening area and allow for a smoother entrance to the facility. If they cannot be done electronically, obviously we can do it verbally at the site. Along with the questionnaire, a mandatory temperature check with a non-contact thermometer will also be administered. Temperatures have to be less than or can't be greater than or equal to 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Once they pass the screening, they're allowed to enter. Coaches will receive a roster of only those eligible, and it will just be the names. It will not include any of the questionnaires or responses to the screening. And you can find that just on Appendix 14 is just kind of the attendance log that we're proposing. On page 9, if an athlete has a positive screen, they are to be removed and isolated. until they can have a parent or guardian pick them up. They are not allowed to participate until they have a written clearance that either their COVID-19 test is negative or one is not warranted. The clearance will be recommended by a healthcare professional. And we will be sending home instructions and a letter, and that will be found on Appendix 7. And that'll give the parents all the information of what they need to do with a positive screen. We will also document how we communicate with parents and guardians, how timing, numbers that were called, the times that they were called, and also we'll start a communication letter to administration or those parties that need to know about a positive COVID screen, and that'll be Appendix 2, our communication plan. If there is a COVID positive test, so an athlete has been tested positive for COVID-19, on page 9, it kind of goes over what the procedures are at that point. These are all based on CDC and the local health networks guidelines. Parents and guardians are immediately notified. Those with close contact, which is within 6 feet, and prolonged interaction greater than or equal to 30 minutes, they are to self-monitor and excluded for 14 days. And again, the administration communication team will be notified, and there'll be proper cleaning of facilities for a COVID positive individual. And that's all I have for health screening.
Thank you, Amy. Randy has the in-session protocols. Randy?
Thank you, Mr. Falco. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, board members. Before I present my piece, I just want to just re-emphasize again this plan's purpose. I know Mr. Falco talked about it to start, but again, this plan is not about competition or events or gameplay at this point. Our goal right now is to get our kids back on our fields, participating, reconnecting with coaches and teammates, but also just giving them an outlet again and giving them an outlet to play, but doing so in a safe environment. So I just wanted to touch on that before I go into my piece here. But I will introduce to you the next part of this, which is the in-play protocol piece of the plan. So basically, what does it look like once coaches and athletes are on the fields and in our facilities? So I'll be covering page 11, 12, and 13. The first part of that is the limitation on number of students participating together. So we do have a limit of 25 people at a time. So you're looking at coaches included. You'll have 25 people per session at any one facility that can participate at one time. And that 25 people will allow for some spacing. You know, if they're at the stadium, you space out your 25 people or student athletes. The next part is no use of locker rooms. So again, this is a 3-phase plan here, and I'm just highlighting right now what's in phase 1. So 25 people, no use of locker rooms. Restrooms will be open, but if anybody's been in athletics before, the locker room is a place that's tough to monitor. Kids will gather. So again, the locker rooms will be closed in phase 1. Workouts, and this is the main piece here, workouts should occur within the same pods. So what that means is you're going to have your groups or your pods participating together throughout a session or throughout a practice, and they will stay with that pod. So if I have 20 soccer players on the field, we could split them up into 4 groups of 5, and those groups of 5 will stay with their pod throughout the session. And that will continue the next day, the next workout, where they're continuing to stay working with the same pod, which obviously can help with just tracing and knowing who interacted with who. So as you continue to phase 2, some of the differences, locker rooms can be open for changing, and meeting rooms. We're still at 25 people at a time for phase 2. Again, you'll see continuing to keep 6 feet apart. That'll be throughout the plan everywhere. I think that's something we've all come accustomed to now, is keeping 6 feet apart. And then if you look at phase 3 for limitation on number of students, it does go up to 250 people at a time. I don't think that's something we're going to be seeing during our summer workouts at this point, but that is there for phase 3. So if you look at page 12, the next piece of this is physical activity and usage of athletic equipment. So when we talk about this piece, in phase one, some of the big items are no contact between teammates. So for example, if you have a group of student athletes from the football team, they're not blocking each other, holding each other. There's no physical contact. Again, the main piece to all of this is that we're just getting kids reacclimated, doing some conditioning and things like that. Athletic equipment, there's no sharing of athletic equipment in phase one to this plan. So balls, bats, gloves cannot be shared in phase one. As you move along to phase two, there is a little bit more leeway with sharing equipment, but it does need to be cleaned in between use. Things like being in a weight room, your spotters, typically a spotter, if they were helping somebody on a bench, you'd be hanging over the top of them or hovering over them. Whereas in this plane, there's some more spacing. So somebody wouldn't be spotting right above them. They might be over on the side of the bar instead. So again, just talking about spacing as you move along through the different phases. Equipment can be shared in phase two. There isn't much of a difference there between phase 1 and 2 as you move along to phase 3 for this piece. But again, equipment can be shared a little bit more as long as it's being cleaned throughout the practice. So I'll move to the last piece that I'm presenting, which is hydration. So if you go to page 13, it talks about individualized hydration. We are not allowed, or I should say students need to bring their own hydration, their own bottles of water or whatever it is that they're bringing with them for the day. So, and that's across the board. If you look at all schools, their plans, student athletes are being asked to bring their own water. Now, I would say in the case of, a student who brought their water and they finished it, I mean, think about a kid walking from 10th and Tillman up to JBC. I mean, by the time they make it up there, they might have finished that bottle of water already by the time they get there. So I know in talking with Amy, she's talked about, having a cooler possibly, but that cooler is being monitored very specifically by the athletic trainer. Again, when you talk about student athletes, I know as a coach, if you just give them a water break and there's a cooler there, you're going to have kids gather, they're going to be touching. I mean, that's just something that we're trying to avoid. So the purpose is to avoid the gatherings and close proximity. The purpose is not to keep kids, from having water, but that's something that we have to do on our end to be creative and having cases of water and things like that there in the case that we would need to provide it. So that's really all I had to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. The post-workout procedures are outlined on page 14. These include hand washing or the use of hand sanitizer to be utilized after workouts. As Randy mentioned, there's no congregating before or after practices. Athletes are be washing their clothing after each workout session, showering at home immediately after workouts, no whirlpools or hot or cold tubs, except in an emergency situation. The cleaning and sanitizing are on page 15. This includes cleaning and disinfection schedules that will be developed by our athletic directors and coaches, cleaning and disinfection of high traffic areas, weight room equipment, and hard surfaces. Mr. Smith will be providing any assistance needed for cleaning and disinfection, including directions on how to use the disinfectant and cleaning solutions. I realize it's quite a bit of information in a very short amount of time. We'll be happy to address any questions that you may have.
Hi, Mr. Falco.
Good evening.
Good evening. I may have skipped over it, but what is the date that you're looking at for this to begin?
Well, our target date, pending board approval, and it would be July 6th. So if the board would approve this, the athletic directors have plans in place to begin the process of creating the educational packets for student athletes, scheduling meetings with coaches and trainers. So that would be the date.
Okay.
Are you
So-
finished? Okay, go ahead.
No, so basically, how are you going to get the word out to the students that may not have participated in the team previous year that might be interested this year?
Athletic directors?
I'll go. I mean, I know for us at Allen and Mr. Stout and I communicate daily, so I know that whatever we're doing at Allen, Deerf is also doing, and vice versa. But one of the things we've been trying to do is blast messages out through our social media pages, but also we could do a school messenger just to let our student athletes know and all families know that this is what's going on, this is the plan. And this plan does, if approved, it does need to go on the website, so we will be sharing it out as well.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Fackel, I was looking at page 6, and it says sports physicals conducted after June 1st is required for regular sports. But those kids who are in the sports from continual, like for instance, the tournaments for this summer, do they have to get a new sports physical, even though they've already been doing things in the spring and into the summer?
Yeah, they're good for a year.
Okay. Okay, that's what I was really concerned about.
And we also, just so you know, Phoebe, we've provided free physicals through St. Luke's.
Right.
That's part of our agreement with them. We're looking at some other dates too for additional physicals. We're still getting the numbers back from the schools as to how many kids or how many kids still need physicals. And we'll be looking at offering another date for those.
And I know we use Messenger and things of that nature, but also can, get with Dr. Brown so we can use La Mega too as well, our radio stations and Latina, so that can really blast it out because we need our kids to participate in sports.
Yeah, Ms. Harris, I'll also add, I forgot to mention this earlier, but it kind of speaks to your question now, as well as Ms. Johnston-Waz's question. We did, for a few weeks, we've kept it open. We did send out a Google form and we put it on all of our social media pages for both Allen, Deerf, and Building 21, as well as our middle schools, where parents and students were able to go on, fill out their interest on what sport they would like to play. They could provide their contact information in that form. And because it's a Google form, it populates all of the results and the responses. And what we were able to do then is share that out to all of our coaches. So our coaches can look at it and say, these are the kids that have shown some interest. We can email them, we can contact them. So that's something else that we've done.
Okay, so we're looking at July 6th for this to go into action. Will our kids who are going to be participating, they're still participating in those tournaments in August, will they be able to get on those fields as soon as possible?
Sure.
Yes, no?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So they'll be able to get on those and do what they need to do, especially our seniors who, got gypped kind of. So we can at least give them that as they're going off to the world.
May I interject on that? The tournaments I think that you're referring to are not PIAA tournaments, and they are not sponsored by the school district.
I was going to say, Dave, just so we're clear, we have those tournaments that are being, the typical summer basketball tournaments that we have, right? Those are separate from our athletic plan and the things that we're going to be doing.
But our ASD students do participate in those.
Yes, they certainly do.
Right, that's what I'm most concerned about. Okay, thank you.
Can I add just one thing in here, and I'll say the same thing for everything that we do. We are closely watching and monitoring the COVID numbers in Allentown so that we are, back to flexibility, able to pivot as necessary if we see those numbers begin to climb. So just to keep that in every conversation moving forward.
To Mr. Parker's point, we've seen so much change with this pandemic, and things change from one piece of guidance to the next. So yes, we keep our eyes and ears closely monitoring PIAA. Our ADs are involved in meetings with other athletic directors, also Lehigh Valley and in our league. So we're all on the same page, and so that we put the safety of our student athletes first. And so we're continuing to monitor.
Thank you so much.
And just to add, these summer workouts all are voluntary. These are not required. If parents do not feel comfortable sending their kids to participate in these, they're not going to be penalized. So these are voluntary. And then working for St. Luke's, I have a contact in infectious disease who is kind of looking over this plan, gave her 2 cents. So if they find that there's a rise, they will let us know, and then we can kind of readjust what we're doing. So between the county, the city, and the local health networks, I think we can probably be ahead of this if things start to go awry.
Okay. But as parents in Allentown, they're gonna send them. They want them out the house. But this is also what the children like to do as well. But
absolutely, and I think the key thing is we're doing it in a safe manner.
Yes.
They could go out to any park and have their soccer game at a field. This allows them to do it safely and in a smart way.
Again, thank you.
We'll be monitoring.
Okay.
And just to, I hope folks got Amy's piece about, the health screening. That QR code is essentially a barcode. And kids will get a piece of paper with a barcode on it. They can answer the 3 questions on the pre-screen on their way to, on their way to practice, on their way to the field. It's very quick. They can also tell when a student filled in the pre-screen. So if a kid did it the day before, they'll be asked to do it again before they attend practice. It's a nice feature.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Are there any other questions?
Sarah, I don't have a question. I just wanted to comment. I reviewed this when Jen sent out the preliminary this weekend, and obviously a lot of time and thought went into this. And I just want to thank, as a parent of 2 athletes who are still Canaries, I want to thank you for the time and effort that you have put forward so that our kids can have an outlet to burn off some steam and reconnect. So thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions or comments, may I have a motion to accept the superintendent's report?
I make the motion.
Ms. Harris, is there a second?
I'll second that.
Ms. Wilt, any discussion on the motion? Seeing and hearing none, Ms. Morello, please call the vote or call the roll.
Mrs. Wilt,
Yes.
Mrs. Johnson Watts,
Yes.
Miss Matheson,
Yes.
Miss Vega,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Thiel,
Yes.
Miss Harris,
Yes.
Mrs. Conover,
Yes.
Mrs. Brace,
Yes,
9-0 passes.
thank you. Next, we're moving on to the personnel report. May I have a motion for the approval of the personnel report?
So moved.
Ms. Wilt, is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Thiel, any discussion on the motion?
Yes.
Ms. Harris?
I know we can't discuss personnel issues, but there's certain things I just don't agree with. And I can't discuss it, but I don't agree with this personnel report.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Seeing and hearing-
Me.
Go ahead, Ms. Conover.
Okay, without naming, I'm just gonna say, I know this was brought up before, but there's some things in the personnel report. that publicly there was an issue, and I just can't move forward with voting in favor of this personnel report, because I feel that some of the changes that are being made with persons in the report is looks like that we're rewarding instead of actually fixing the problem. And for that reason, and I know because of personnel reasons, we can't be real specific or call names, and I'm purposely acknowledging that. So I'm not trying to do that, but for that reason, I will not vote in favor of.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or discussion? Seeing and hearing none, please call the roll.
Mrs. Conover. Mrs. Conover,
No, nay.
Miss Matheson,
Yes.
Miss Vega,
No.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Thiel,
Yes.
Miss Harris,
No.
Mrs. Johnson Watts,
No.
Mrs. Brace,
Yes.
Mrs. Wilt,
Yes.
5-4 passes.
Okay, thank you. Next is the finance report. I think we'll vote on both of these things separate. So we have the budget and then the farmstead exclusion resolution. So we'll start with the budget. May I have a motion for the approval of Exhibit A, the final budget for fiscal year 2020 through 2021?
So moved.
Mr. Thiel, is there a second?
I'll second it.
Ms.
Audrey?
Matheson? Is there any discussion on the motion?
Absolutely. Anyone who could tax our residents, our homeowners, our renters, 4% has no empathy. They don't understand what's going on. I sent my board pictures of Tent City. You're going to put more people out there in Tent City. They're going to lose their homes. They're going to not be able to pay the rent because the landlord is going to put that mortgage, their rent up by 4%. And that's between eating, medicine, taking care of their children. And they're not going to be able to handle it. So we already got 3% of our students homeless. We're going to have more. And if you can, in good conscience, not realize this and have some sort of empathy for our people of Allentown, you will say no to this. But of those of you who say yes, Allentown, look at the people who are going to say yes. You're going to see the division. And it's going to go by color. That's enough.
This is Linda.
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Vega.
Can we pull out the 4% and vote on that separate?
No, yeah, this is to vote on the actual budget.
Okay, so if we vote now, then we're voting on the 4%, right? Either way.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. I'm sorry.
Yes, the motion right now is to vote on the budget as presented, which is with a 4% increase.
Okay, so if I wanted to put a motion, would I do that now? Or would I wait?
A motion for what?
Amendment.
Amendment, sorry.
Yes, now would be the time to do an amendment to the budget.
Okay, so I want to do an amendment for the 2.5%.
Okay, so there's a motion on the floor to amend the original motion, which is for a 2.5% increase. Is there a second to that amendment?
I will second that amendment. I will second it.
Okay, Ms. Harris seconded. Discussion on this motion, which is to amend to 2.5%. Seeing, oh, go ahead.
I don't want any, but I know you're going to, I know what's going to happen. So I will agree with Linda.
Okay, any other discussion on the amendment?
Yeah, I just would like to say that looking at the chart that was presented earlier, you know, by reducing this, the millage rate increase, you're really like draining our account, especially when it comes to next year's budget. You have to think about like our kids and the future of our kids, especially next year's budget. Our budget is almost balanced with a $9 million CARES Act, a one-time payment. So if you took that out, you have a substantial hole. So I mean, you can make this motion to lower that, but we're going to pay for it next year. So it's really your choice on how you want to address this, the structural deficit we have in the school district. So I would like to say that you're going to pay for it now or later.
And we're going to also see people not have food, not live in a house, get kicked out of their homes. So how does that benefit our children?
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Ms. Conover's hand is up. So Ms. Conover, if you would like to comment.
I just think that we should be looking at other options. We never, I heard somebody from the public say something about we're not looking at consultants, we're not looking at contracts. You know, it's always, to me, it feels like to raise taxes and not give much of nothing is the easier thing to do.
So I have not heard one suggestion on what you want to cut. So if someone has a suggestion, Superintendent Parker has before sent out the list of programs that need to be cut, or you can cut personnel. So who wants to make a suggestion?
It's not always, Mr. Miller, cutting programs or cutting personnel. Well, if we're going to cut personnel, we can start with administration. I mean, that's been said. This is not our first meeting.
You have a bare bones administration now. I mean, you're asking administration personnel.
I'm just saying in general, what has happened, and I don't want to sound argumentative because we're trying to work towards a resolve. I'm just saying over the 3 years that I've been on the board, and I don't know if you were following us at that time. Maybe you were, maybe you weren't. Well, not. We've always made suggestions to why it doesn't, we can't take from the taxpayers. I talked earlier about money that's owed to us from the NISDA. Nobody ever wants to talk about it. It took them 2 years to talk about that. Before, when you said NIS, people act like you were speaking a different language. So there's money and there's ways that we can cut back, and we can't keep threatening our kids and threatening our programs if we don't get the norm. And this is what's put us in the position that we've been put in. You know, these contracts come across the table, and then the previous board approved it, and now we're paying them for 20 years, and you keep coming back to the taxpayers.
Which contracts are you referring to?
Say it again?
Which contracts have we been paying the last 20 years? So,
which contracts? It could be, it's many contracts. It could be a transportation. It could be contracts that we don't even discuss at these board meetings. These contracts that have been developed in private rooms.
I think we all signed the transportation contract.
We're all what? Say it again?
We were all in on the transportation contract.
I'm talking about prior to, Mr. Miller. There's other contracts within our school district. Let's start with the IU. We can talk about the IU. We agreed to 850, and I think we're probably paying $1 million. I don't know what it is because that's not always, but I don't, like I said, I want to get back and forth. The board members that were here before you got here, I think you've been here, what, 3 months, 6 months? They know. Charlie knows. You guys hang out. Ask him. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. Let's look at different areas besides looking to put the bill on the taxpayers when we're not giving them anything. And I heard somebody from the public say they don't want to hear it again, but you're going to hear it again. And I'm going to keep saying it because my kids is in the district too. What are we paying for? It took COVID-19 to pull the mask off the fact that we weren't one of one school districts. And the day before, the district made an announcement that they were going to do something about trying to get computers and make us become a one-on-one. In a private conversation, I was told, oh, it ain't never going to happen. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I didn't want to take this moment to expose the district. All I'm asking is stop putting the bill on the taxpayers and start looking at other resources. Is it easy to have the conversation with me or be a bully to me? than to go to the people who really owe us the money?
Go ahead.
No, I'm listening.
I think the NIS point, we've been through that a couple of times. We realized a gain in the increase in property values in the NIS zone. And I'm pretty sure there's a breakout floating around for that. I'm unaware of a specific contract that the NIS was going to pay.
That's exactly what I'm saying. You're unaware. And that's exactly what I'm saying.
Correct.
So until you become aware, because I've been here 3 years, then you can, I hear you, but we have to find other options. Raising the taxes.
So to answer your point, so Superintendent Parker, is there a contract between NIS and the Allentown School District for an additional revenue that the NIS was going to pay the school district?
So what my understanding is, the revenue we receive from the NIS is from the property values of the properties in the NIS.
Correct.
So we receive that tax value each year, and we've carved that out before and shared it. I think even earlier this year, we can reshare that information out so that you can see what the value of the properties are within the footprint of the NIS. That's the revenue that we receive.
Okay, so Lisa, to your point, so there is no other income that we're expecting from them. So we can revisit that again if you want to and go through what we just did, but that's the point.
No, the point is that's what they're telling you.
Excuse me. I'm going to interrupt here only because I see this back and forth going, and I've had my hand up, and Nick, I have not seen your hand. With all due respect, I know that you were leading the previous meeting, but we are in this other meeting. Do I have permission, Sarah, to speak?
Yes, go ahead, Ms. Johnson-Watts.
Okay, so in terms of the ANISDA, there has to be a time where they are going to present to us, the current board, what was agreed upon with the previous board, so that we are fully transparent and we understand what we are expecting of them. There was a time when the secretary's report listed whether it was zero or whatever other dollar amount it was. I repeatedly vote no on the secretary's report, and I'll say it here and now why. Because we no longer delineate the funding from the NIS. I don't want to get into a NIS conversation all night, but I do not want us to in any way give the public the sense that we are fully aware as a board as to what we should be anticipating each year. And it should not be embedded in the local taxes, because that is an opportunity zone which has a different type of structure than a regular home in the area. So I just want to put a pin in that conversation there. My understanding is someone from the ANISDA Allentown Neighborhood Improvement Zone Development Authority is supposedly going to come and present to the board and perhaps even administration staff. We need to have that with the quickness, even if we do approve or disapprove this budget tonight, because that conversation needs to end, because we need to know why it seems as though the homeowners are bearing the brunt of a development. So I'm just going to leave that right there. My only other concern is that when you look at our budget and you look at charters, I need to make this very clear. When people talk about charter schools and some of the successes that they've had financially, and when people look at school districts and the deficit that we're experiencing here in Allentown, we must understand that is apples and oranges. You are talking about a group of people who had a mission, created a vision, and said, this is how much it's going to cost to do it. And they raised the funds, and now they're carrying out the plan. Let's not confuse that with 100-year-old school district or more that has inherited a budget every year, which I chose to serve on the finance committee so that we could stop the snowball effect and begin to understand the rationale for why all of these line items exist. Now, I faced opposition in the process. I've even said I'd be fine if we just went to flat zero deficit mode and allowed the state to intervene, because this is crisis, and it's been crisis from the time I ran to be on this school board. Now, I'm going to be on this school board for 4 years, and I will see whether or not we do all that we need to do to stem the tide of this snowball of always being in a deficit mode. But it's also going to take each of us looking at those salaries. How many of those salaries should exist? How many of those salaries are based on the fact that people don't use an electronic pay system? And when I bring it up every year, people just forget about it, but we're not on an electronic pay timekeeping system. So there are a lot of things that are essential to the inner workings of a proper budget that we are getting there. I voted no for the IU. I voted no. And then people are looking at me like I am not a responsible human being. No, I'm more of a persistent evaluator of circumstances. So here we are, we're with the IU, and they had a blanket 450,000 to 850,000 potential expense. Well, we've already surpassed that, and there's still more work to be done. What I'm saying tonight is whether I vote yes or no, let's stop acting like we have our stuff together, and let's just be humble and accept the fact that we're still in the midst of an evolutionary process. Prayerfully, we'll get there before 2021.
Thank you, Mr. Parker, you've heard a lot. If you would like to comment on anything before I go to other board members.
Just a few things that I'd like to speak to. And I'll begin with Niz. I have been in contact prior to COVID. We were scheduled to have a conversation with NISDA and the finance co-chairs. It was actually scheduled for the same month that we shut down because of COVID. So we are rescheduling that conversation with the co-chairs for, we're going to try to shoot for a date in July so that we can revisit that conversation now that we're back in some level of normalcy. So just to kind of, again, I'm just a believer in making sure that we have some levity in terms of the numbers, the figures, the impact. And I understand the creation of the charter schools and how that started with a group of people who had a vision and some resources and raised money and all those things. And that's great. However, our current budget, it's a $60 million a year cost that does impact us in the school district and our ability to meet the needs of kids each and every day, which is why I say again, if we're going to be honest to the conversation around the real issues and areas where there's impact to budget, it's overall the funding mechanism for the district, the formulaic way in which school districts receive funding that Allentown and other districts are on the other side of some funding disparities. That's A. And then B, the funding formula for charter schools, regardless of whose vision it was and how they work towards it, it's financed through the taxpayers here. So that tax increase that is part of the budget actually goes into the charter schools as well. The transportation costs for the district, a large portion of that is for transportation of charter school students. We cannot ignore the impact of that on our budget. So if we're looking at things that we can work to mitigate costs, to create spaces and areas for the children that we serve, that has to be an area where we take a critical eye to ways to reduce costs, specifically through the formulaic way in which those resources are allocated. With no disrespect or no umbrage to anybody and what their vision is, I'm talking formula and expense. How do we mitigate some of the expense so that the school district still has the ability to proceed and process information as necessary financially? If we look back to our and we had it at the beginning of the finance presentation, resource deficiency is the biggest challenge in the Allentown School District and will continue to impact student achievement until it's something that we address in a large way. So in the past, we've shared the non-regulatory cost document with the district. It is not pretty when you go to drastically reduce expenses in a district that is already reduced to a significant level. Administratively, who are you gonna cut? We don't have a whole lot of much left. We're on a skeleton crew at the central office with some positions that we need to fill and some positions that are budgeted but not resourced because we can't afford it. But a small team compared to every other district our size in the Commonwealth and across the country. We've shared that data. So there's not an overspending on the people in the district because our salaries are even in the lower quadrant of districts in our county. So even if you look through the lens of equity in the comparison of salaries, we're on the lower quadrant of salaries with less people making those lower quadrants of salaries. So we have to find ways to increase significantly the amount of resources that are available for the children that we serve. Everything else, respectfully, is still kicking each other in the same bucket because we haven't committed to increasing the bucket. I support the NIS conversation because that's talking about increasing the bucket. I have no issue there whatsoever. That's part of increasing the bucket, but we've got to focus on increasing the buckets because otherwise we're still going around and around and not talking about some of the critical things that are going to be important for the district. The IU contract is, again, another example. The IU contract compared to the impact to budget is minuscule in the grand scheme of all of the expenses that the district has. And in addition to it being minuscule compared to all of the issues, it's critical for ASD because we did have significant issues as called out in our fiscal audit and our curriculum audit in terms of our business office operations. So committing to address and fix those has become absolutely important. So I think levity to the conversation is important and sets the ground for whatever we want to decide tonight. And then as we move into July, to have some of those conversations about ways to drastically increase revenue are going to be important and critical.
And Mr. Parker, point of clarification, I was saying to compare the financial condition of the two, charter and the district, is apples and oranges for the very reason of the structure of which they sit on.
So I don't think it's apples and oranges. It's apples, it's oranges and tangerines because the charter school funding is a pocket within the school district funding. So when you pull out the funding for the charter schools, then you're left with whatever you have left to educate the rest of the kids. And this bucket gets paid first. And if this bucket is paid first, then whatever's left here is whatever's left. So if we can condense this bucket, there's more left for this bucket. So it's not apples and oranges, it works together.
But what I'm saying is comparing the ability to balance budgets is a separate conversation. You can say that they're interdependent in that way. What I'm saying is the ability to not have a deficit in a charter mode is a separate conversation than are continuing to have a deficit. Yes, you can point to charters and you can point to other expenses that build that. But what I'm trying to educate those who have questions as to why we continue to be in a deficit mode, they need to understand that this is inherited. This is a snowball. This is us trying to make everything come together. And without a doubt, funding, whether it's the formula for charters, whether it's what the state decides to do, whether it's what the federal government decides to do. But we have to increase that. So I just, yeah, boom. So I just want to make that clear as people listen to this exchange about how we're trying to get the budget done. There has been great progress in a short span of time, but there is much more work that has to be done. But we cannot just pull the skin off of the skeleton and assume that now everything's going to live and breathe. We have to be surgeons ultimately. And I think surgically we're evolving over time. So I just had to clarify that.
Absolutely agree.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Watts. Seeing and hearing no other discussion or comments, again, this is to vote on the amendment, which is to change the tax millage increase from 4.0 to 2.5%. Ms. Murillo, if you can call the roll for the amendment to the main motion.
Ms. Vega,
Yes.
Ms. Matheson,
No.
Mr. Miller,
No.
Mr. Thiel,
No.
Mrs. Johnson-Watts,
Yes.
Ms. Harris,
Yes.
Mrs. Brace,
No.
Mrs. Wilt,
No.
Mrs. Conover,
Yes.
5-4, amendment fails.
Okay, so we're back to the main motion, which is the budget as presented. Ms. Conover and Ms. Johnson-Watts, can you put your hands down? I think you forgot to put them down before I ask for questions or comments, so we can start over again. Ms. Vega?
Yep. I'm going to do another amendment for the 3%.
Okay. Is there a second to the amendment for 3%?
I'll second the motion.
Ms. Harris, any discussion on the motion for 3%? Seeing and hearing none, please call the roll.
Mr. Miller,
No.
Mr. Thiel,
No.
Mrs. Conover,
No.
Ms. Harris,
Yes.
Mrs. Brace,
No.
Mrs. Wilt,
No.
Mrs. Johnson-Watts,
No.
Ms. Matheson,
No.
Ms. Vega,
Yes.
7-2, amendment fails.
Okay, we're back again to the original motion, which is to approve the budget as presented. Is there any discussion? Seeing and hearing none, please call the roll.
Ms. Matheson,
Yes.
Ms. Vega,
No.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Thiel,
Yes.
Mrs. Brace,
Yes.
Mrs. Conover,
No.
Mrs. Johnson-Watts,
No.
Mrs. Wilt,
Yes.
Ms. Harris,
Shame on you. No.
5-4, motion passes.
Okay. Next is for the approval of the homestead farmstead exclusion resolution. May I have a motion for the approval of Exhibit C in the finance report?
I'll make the motion.
Mr. Miller, is there a second?
I'll second.
Ms. Johnson-Watts, any discussion on the motion? Seeing and hearing none, please call the roll.
Mr. Thiel,
Yes.
Mrs. Conover,
Yes.
Ms. Harris,
Yes.
Mrs. Brace,
Yes.
Mrs. Wilt,
Yes.
Mrs. Johnson-Watts,
Yes.
Ms. Matheson,
Yes.
Ms. Vega,
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Yes.
9-0 passes.
Thank you. Now is the time, if anybody from the public would like to speak on non-agenda items, if you raise your hand, you'll be recognized. Sharon Billington.
Sharon Billington, 1509 Chew Street, Allentown. I have heard talk of state takeover now for a number of years, or to let the state do it. I have researched what it actually means to be designated as under a state takeover, which has 3 categories: financial watch, financial recovery, or receivership by the Commonwealth of PA. And frankly, I could not find any examples of a positive outcome. The Commonwealth does not come in with a wad of money to pay off our debts. It assists in establishing budgets, then mandates which expenses are priorities. In order to satisfy this requirement, staff and services are always reduced or eliminated, and local taxes are always raised to their yearly state maximum amounts, or in some cases, even beyond. School districts in these classifications have not improved and have remained on their watch status for 5 years or more, and have then been downgraded to the recovery or receivership status, thereby confirming the inability of the Commonwealth to actually improve these situations. But most importantly, these children were not being taken care of. In 2013, Philadelphia School District had to cut over 3,000 positions in order to meet the budgetary requirements, and Philly had already been in receivership status since 2001. About 2/3 of these positions directly had to do with the health, welfare, and safety of the students. Philadelphia only got out of these statuses because they implemented a soda tax on their own, not by the state. Over half the students in Chester Upland District are in charter schools, which are performing neither better than, and in numerous schools, worse than the district-run schools had. In Duquesne, they only operate a K through 6th grades. All the secondary students are shipped to surrounding districts, and this is under state control. We have made great strides in our district to meet the diverse needs of all of our students and to make their education rigorous, relevant, and rewarding. We need to work together for the good of all of our children and their future. As I said in the past, it has taken years of fiscal mismanagement, political pandering, unfunded mandates, and reimbursement cuts to get us into this mess. Unfortunately, it will take years of corrective measures and hard decisions to get ourselves out, but it should be our decision. We can take care of our children better than the state has proven to be able to do. So please do not think the state is going to come in and make anything any better. In most cases, it has become worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Billington. Robert Smith. You can state your name and address.
Street. Robert E. Smith Jr., 1060 East Gordon Street. Can you hear me, Madam President?
I can.
Thank you. I want to thank, I didn't have time or chance to thank the board for the other day's vote on the naming of the school. Thank you. Ms. Harris, Ms. Conover, Ms. Johnson Watts, thank you so much for voting no on the tax increase. And Miss Linda Vega, the first budget, you had the courage to make amendments and not rubber stamp the administration. Thank you so much as a taxpayer. Thank you so much for considering the students and the employees at the same time the taxpayers. All you wanted to do is make amendments to make it a little less for the taxpayers, the senior citizens, the hardworking families. And I commend the 4 of you for voting no on the tax increase. It took courage. It took courage. And as a new board member, I know it wasn't easy to do this. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Seeing no other public hands up for public comment. Is there any old business come before the board? Any new business? Have a motion to adjourn tonight's meeting.
So moved.
Johnson Watts, is there a second?
I second.
Ms. Harris, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.